Hey, dreamer. Welcome to Sleep Theory. Before we drift off, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. Tap that like button and subscribe. It helps the algorithm share this with more people like us.
Sometimes a single sentence can shake everything we think we know. Sometimes a question doesn't give us an answer. It opens a fracture in reality itself. If this kind of exploration speaks to you, consider liking the video and subscribing for more. In this video, we're stepping into the strange world of paradoxes, where logic unravels, meaning bends, and nothing is as simple as it seems. If you're ready to challenge your mind, let's begin. The liar paradox. This sentence is false. It's a short sentence, made up of only 4 words. At first glance, it seems almost like a clever riddle, the kind of thing you might see printed on a novelty mug or passed around as a joke. But when you pause to think about it, something unsettling begins to happen. If the sentence is true, then it is, as it claims, false. But if it's false, then what it says must not be the case, which means it must be true. This simple loop creates a contradiction. The sentence undermines itself. It cannot be consistently labeled as true or false without causing a logical collapse. And yet, it's clearly a sentence in English. Grammatically correct and understandable. It's not gibberish. So why does it break everything we expect from language? This is known as the liar paradox, and it has puzzled philosophers and logicians for over 2,000 years. The paradox challenges one of our most basic assumptions, that every meaningful statement is either true or false. This principle, called bivalence, underpins most of how we reason, debate, and make sense of the world. When someone makes a claim, we instinctively try to verify whether it matches reality. But the liar paradox doesn't cooperate. It creates a kind of logical glitch, a sentence that cannot settle into either category without contradicting itself. It doesn't say something vague or poetic. It makes a direct claim about its own truth, and that self-reference is the root of the problem. To avoid this paradox, some have suggested introducing a third category, a statement that is neither true nor false. This sounds like a reasonable escape at first. Not every sentence may need to fit into a binary system. But this move quickly runs into complications. If you say the sentence is neither true nor false, then it is not true. And if that's what the sentence itself claims, that it is not true, then its claim is accurate, which would make it true. And so, the contradiction returns. The paradox doesn't go away just because we try to widen our definitions. Even reformulations like replacing false with not true lead us back into the same loop, now known as the strengthened liar. It's as if the paradox adjusts itself to bypass every solution we invent. Some philosophers have proposed that the real issue lies in self-reference. That is, a sentence referring to itself in a way that allows it to speak about its own truth. They argue that perhaps language should be structured to prevent this, introducing levels or hierarchies where a sentence cannot evaluate itself directly. But even this approach runs into trouble because we can create versions of the liar paradox using multiple sentences that refer to each other, forming a circular structure that leads to the same contradiction without directly using self-reference. In this sense, the problem isn't just linguistic. It touches something deeper, the limits of our systems, the boundaries of logic, and the foundations of how we define truth itself. What makes the liar paradox so unsettling is not just that it can't be resolved, but that it is so simple. It doesn't require advanced mathematics, abstract philosophy, or hidden complexity. It uses everyday language and basic logic, the same tools we use to navigate reality, and reveals a fundamental instability in them. If something this basic can fall apart so easily, what does that say about more complex systems we trust? The paradox exposes how much of our reasoning depends on consistency and structure. When that structure fails, even briefly, it leaves us wondering how reliable any of it really is. In everyday life, we rarely confront paradoxes like this. We assume our statements mean what they say. But the liar paradox lingers in the background as a reminder that not all questions have answers. That language, for all its usefulness, has cracks, and that our desire for certainty may be stronger than what logic can offer. Some puzzles are not meant to be solved. They exist to show us the edges of thought, the places where clarity ends and contradiction begins. This sentence is false is one of those puzzles. It doesn't teach us what is true or false. It teaches us that even truth itself can be uncertain. Grandfather paradox. Time travel has long captured human imagination, not just in science fiction, but in serious philosophical debate. One of the most famous thought experiments in this area is the grandfather paradox. It begins with a seemingly simple idea. What if you could travel back in time and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother? If you were successful, your parent would never be born, and by extension, neither would you. But if you were never born, then how? Could you have traveled back in time in the first place to commit the act that prevents your existence? The loop collapses under its own weight, raising a troubling contradiction that challenges our understanding of causality, the relationship between cause and effect. At the heart of the paradox is a clash between two intuitions. On one hand, we assume that if something happens, it must have a cause. On the other, we assume that time travel, if possible, should allow for free action, including changing the past. But the moment you try to alter events that directly affect your own existence, you create a logical inconsistency. It's as if the timeline is both fixed and flexible at the same time, and neither possibility seems entirely satisfying. Some interpretations of the paradox suggest that time travel to the past must be self-consistent, that any attempt to change the past would be either impossible or would somehow end up preserving the existing timeline. In this view, events might resist alteration in subtle ways, or the traveler's actions would become part of history itself, ensuring continuity rather than disruption. Other theories propose that changes to the past could result in the creation of alternate timelines or parallel universes. In that case, going back and preventing your grandfather's relationship might not erase your own existence, but instead create a new branch of reality where you were never born, while the original timeline, including you, remains untouched. This interpretation allows for paradox-free time travel, but at the cost of multiplying realities endlessly. It's a solution that appeals to many science fiction writers and physicists exploring concepts like the multiverse, but it also raises new questions. If every decision spawns an alternate world, then which version of events is truly real? And what happens to personal responsibility in a universe where every possibility plays out somewhere? Beyond the theoretical physics, the grandfather paradox forces us to think more deeply about identity, causation, and the nature of time itself. We live with the assumption that the past is fixed, the present is where we act, and the future is open. Time travel disturbs this model by making the past accessible and, possibly, editable. But once the past is open to change, the stability of everything built upon it comes into question. Are we the authors of our timeline, or are we simply characters, following a script already written? If a single action in the past can erase the entire chain of events leading to our own birth, how fragile is the continuity we call reality? What makes the grandfather paradox especially powerful is that it doesn't rely on complex science or abstract logic. It's intuitive. Anyone can grasp the contradiction it presents, and it taps into something deeper than just physics. It touches on the fear of disrupting the natural order, the desire to undo regrets, and the fantasy of controlling destiny. It also reveals the tension between freedom and structure. If time is a sequence of fixed events, then our actions are bound by what has already happened. But if we can change the past, then even the reasons we exist are uncertain. That's not just a scientific dilemma, it's a personal one. In the end, the paradox might not be a problem to solve, but a mirror to reflect the limits of our understanding. Time, causality, and selfhood are concepts we often take for granted, but the grandfather paradox exposes how unstable they become under closer examination. Whether time travel is ever possible is still an open question. But even as a thought experiment, this paradox forces us to confront the possibility that some questions about who we are, where we come from, and whether the past can ever be changed don't have clean answers. And perhaps what unsettles us most is the idea that if we could change the past, we might erase ourselves in the process. paradox of choice. Imagine walking into a supermarket to buy a simple bottle of olive oil. You expect to grab one quickly and move on, but then you're confronted with a shelf offering 28 different options. Extra virgin, cold-pressed, organic, imported, infused, filtered, unfiltered, in glass bottles, in plastic ones. You stand there frozen, scanning labels, trying to make the right choice. What should have taken 30 seconds stretches into minutes. You begin to worry about price, quality, ethics, taste. Eventually, you pick one, but you don't feel relief. Instead, you leave wondering whether you made the best decision. This is the paradox of choice. The idea that while having options can empower us, too many options can lead to anxiety, paralysis, and dissatisfaction. It seems counterintuitive. More choice should be a good thing. It represents freedom, control, autonomy. But in practice, it often does the opposite. The term was popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz, who argued that modern societies, particularly in the West, have taken the value of choice to an extreme. In theory, choice allows individuals to shape their own lives. It promises that if we look hard enough, we can find the perfect partner, the ideal job, the exact product that fits our needs. But this abundance of possibility creates a new kind of pressure, the pressure to get it right. When options multiply, so does the fear of choosing wrong, and even after a decision is made, it's often accompanied by regret, second-guessing, or the haunting thought that a better alternative was just one shelf away. This isn't just about grocery shopping, it extends into every corner of life. Dating apps with endless profiles, career paths that split into dozens of specializations, streaming platforms with thousands of titles. We scroll, swipe, compare, and hesitate. The more we compare, the more our standards rise. The more perfect something seems, the more every flaw stands out. Even when we find something good, we wonder if something better was just beyond what we tried. Ironically, having fewer options can sometimes lead to greater satisfaction. When we commit to something because it's the best of 3 choices, we're more likely to appreciate it than if we picked it from a list of 50. This is because we don't have to live with the mental burden of what if. Choice overload also encourages perfectionism. It suggests that not only is the perfect option out there, it's your responsibility to find it. If you end up unhappy with your decision, it's not just unfortunate, it's your fault. You had the freedom to choose, and you still ended up with something flawed. This mindset can be exhausting. It turns everyday decisions into high-stakes calculations, where even small errors feel significant. Instead of feeling grateful for options, we feel overwhelmed by them. And instead of feeling empowered, we feel anxious. At the same time, not having any choices is clearly a problem too. People deprived of choice often feel powerless, trapped, or oppressed. So the solution isn't to eliminate choice altogether, but to recognize that more is not always better. There is a balance to be found. Enough choice to feel free, but not so much that we drown in it. Recognizing this paradox doesn't mean we reject modern life or long for the simplicity of the past. It means we become more mindful of how we navigate our options. Sometimes, limiting choices or accepting good enough can bring more peace than chasing the illusion of the perfect outcome. Ultimately, the paradox of choice is not just about the number of options, but about the expectations and mental habits that come with them. We're told we can have anything we want, but rarely warned about the cost of wanting everything. Learning to live with decisions, to commit, and to accept imperfection isn't giving up. It's taking back control. And in a world overflowing with possibilities, learning to say, "This is enough," might be one of the most powerful choices we can make. The unexpected hanging paradox. A judge tells a prisoner that he will be hanged at noon on one weekday in the following week. But the execution will be a surprise. He will not know the day until the moment the guards arrive at his cell. The prisoner thinks carefully. If the execution hasn't happened by Thursday night, then Friday must be the day. But if he knows it must be Friday, then it won't be a surprise. And so, according to the judge's condition, it can't be Friday. So he eliminates Friday. Then he reasons, if Friday is impossible and the execution hasn't happened by Wednesday night, then it must be Thursday. But again, that wouldn't be a surprise. He continues this logic backwards through the week, eliminating every day one by one. Finally, he concludes that the hanging cannot occur at all. Feeling triumphant, he relaxes. And then, on Wednesday at noon, the guards arrive. He is shocked. The judge was right. The hanging was unexpected. This is the unexpected hanging paradox. At first, it seems like a clever word puzzle, but the more you examine it, the more it challenges your understanding of logic, prediction, and knowledge. The prisoner's reasoning appears valid. He uses deduction to eliminate each possibility, following the rules of logic step by step, and yet he ends up completely wrong. His conclusion, that the hanging won't happen, is based on reasoning that seems airtight, but the event still happens, and it surprises him. The paradox lies in the tension between what he can logically deduce and what actually occurs. It raises a fundamental question: can certain knowledge about a future event prevent that event from being a surprise? And if so, does that knowledge change the event itself? One interpretation is that the prisoner's mistake is in assuming that knowledge and surprise can coexist in the way he imagines. He believes that if he can predict the day, it ceases to be a surprise, and therefore cannot happen. But that assumes his predictions are correct, and that the judge's conditions obey strict logical rules. What if the flaw isn't in the event, but in his belief that he can logically predict it in the first place? After all, the judge didn't say the execution would defy all reasoning, only that it would be unexpected, and the prisoner's expectation, shaped by overthinking, becomes the very thing that sets him up for surprise. The paradox goes beyond the courtroom. It speaks to our need for certainty, our tendency to overanalyze, forecast, and mentally control the future. We try to plan for what's coming, to eliminate the unknown, to make life predictable. But in doing so, we can fall into traps where our reasoning collapses not because it's irrational, but because it fails to account for the limits of foresight. The unexpected hanging paradox is unsettling because it shows how logic, when turned inward and used recursively, can undermine itself. The prisoner tries to think his way out of uncertainty, but thinking itself becomes the trap. This paradox also reflects a deeper discomfort, the unpredictability of life. We crave control, but true surprise, genuine unpredictability, cannot be conquered by deduction. Events often unfold in ways that outpace our expectations, not because we're illogical, but because the systems we apply logic to don't always follow our rules. In this case, the judge's message isn't bound by clean formal logic. It plays with psychology, perception, and the timing of belief. The moment the prisoner convinced himself the event couldn't happen, he became vulnerable to it. His false sense of certainty created the perfect condition for surprise. In broader terms, the paradox challenges the idea that we can always know what's coming, that if we're just smart enough, careful enough, we can avoid the unexpected. But some things defy calculation. Surprise, by its very nature, resists prediction. The more we try to trap it with logic, the more it slips away, only to appear when we've finally let our guard down. The prisoner's error was not stupidity, but overconfidence in a system of reasoning that wasn't built for ambiguity. And perhaps that's the lesson. Life will surprise us, not because we fail to think hard enough, but because some parts of experience will always live outside the reach of certainty. The mask paradox. There's a quiet tension that exists between who we are and who we appear to be. In daily life, most people wear some kind of mask. Not a physical one, but a social version of themselves shaped by expectations, context, and fear of rejection. We adjust our tone, our words, even our expressions depending on who we're with. We hide our insecurities, exaggerate our confidence, soften our opinions, or play a role we think will be accepted. This isn't necessarily dishonest. It's often considered normal. But at some point, a question begins to emerge. If people love the version of you that wears the mask, do they really love you? Or do they love the mask? That's the heart of the mask paradox. The unsettling realization that seeking connection through inauthenticity might result in acceptance, but not for who you truly are. The paradox becomes more intense when we consider how relationships are formed. People crave connection, belonging, and recognition, but many fear being fully seen, worried that their true self might be judged or rejected. So instead, they curate a version of themselves that feels safer, more likable, more stable, more aligned with what others seem to want. Over time, this version becomes practiced, even automatic. But the cost is subtle and heavy. When affection, praise, or love comes toward that version, there's a lingering emptiness underneath. A thought: if they knew the real me, would they still care? This isn't limited to romantic relationships. It happens at work, in friendships, even online. The more curated the identity, the more attention it may receive, but the more distant it may feel from the self. As this continues, the person behind the mask can begin to feel invisible, even in the midst of connection. It creates a strange kind of loneliness, being surrounded by people who seem to admire you, while feeling unknown at the same time. And the longer this dynamic goes on, the harder it becomes to take off the mask. Vulnerability starts to feel risky. The fear shifts from being judged to being exposed. That if you suddenly dropped the act, people would feel deceived or disappointed. Some might argue that everyone wears a mask to some degree, and that identity is always shaped by context. We behave differently with a close friend than with a stranger, and that doesn't mean we're lying. This is true to a point. But the paradox isn't about adapting to situations. It's about hiding to survive socially and the psychological toll that comes with it. The danger arises when the mask becomes more familiar than the face underneath, when people no longer remember what they're hiding, only that they're afraid to be fully honest. At its core, the mask paradox challenges our assumptions about love and belonging. If connection is based on performance, then the person being accepted isn't the real you. But if you risk honesty and are rejected, that pain cuts much deeper. So which path is better? Safe illusion or vulnerable reality? Many settle for the former, telling themselves that being accepted, even behind a mask, is better than being alone. But over time, the cost adds up. Emotional disconnection, identity confusion, and even depression can take root in the gap between self and appearance. There's no perfect answer to the paradox. Life is complex, and absolute authenticity isn't always practical or safe. Some roles demand a certain degree of performance, but the key may lie in being aware of when and why the mask is being worn. Are you choosing it for protection, or because you believe the real you is unworthy? Are you hiding to avoid discomfort, or because you've forgotten how to be seen? In the end, the paradox is less about whether we wear masks, and more about whether we ever take them off. It's about the quiet desire to be known fully and loved anyway. The fear that if we show our true self, we might lose everything, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone will look past the performance and see the person underneath, not as a disappointment, but as something real, flawed, and worthy of connection. Ship of Theseus. Imagine a ship setting sail across the sea, strong, elegant, and proud. As the years pass, pieces of it begin to wear down. A wooden plank rots and is replaced. Then a sail tears and is mended. The rudder is swapped out. Eventually, every single part of the ship has been replaced, one by one, until no original piece remains. And yet, the ship continues its journey, still known by the same name, Theseus's ship. At what point did it stop being the original? Or is it still the same ship? Now, suppose someone had gathered all the discarded pieces and reassembled them elsewhere. Would that be the real ship of Theseus? This ancient thought experiment forces us to ask a surprisingly modern question. What makes something, or someone, the same over time? We usually assume that identity is stable, that a thing remains itself as long as it continues to exist. But the ship of Theseus challenges this idea. It shows how, even with gradual change, we can arrive at something entirely different, without ever noticing a clear moment of transformation. This isn't just about boats. The paradox applies to everything and everyone that changes over time. Consider the human body. Most of the cells in your body are replaced over the years. The person you were as a child is biologically gone. Even your thoughts, preferences, and memories evolve. Are you still the same person? And if so, what part of you remained constant? Some argue that identity lies in continuity. As long as the changes happen gradually and the process is uninterrupted, the thing remains the same. Others believe that identity depends on structure or function. If it behaves and looks like the original, we treat it as such. But both ideas are fragile under scrutiny. If identity is continuity, what happens when memory fails? If it's structure, then which version is more authentic? The one that grew naturally over time, or the one rebuilt from the original parts? The paradox doesn't offer a clear answer, and that's what makes it so powerful. In today's world, the ship of Theseus plays out in countless ways. A company rebrands, changes its staff, its mission, even its products. Is it still the same company? A relationship evolves, partners change, roles shift. Is it still the same relationship? On a personal level, people reinvent themselves. They change careers, beliefs, habits. At what point do we stop being who we were and become someone new? Or do we ever truly change at all? The paradox also invites us to think about authenticity. What matters more? The history behind something or the version we see now? In museums, we value original artifacts. But what if a replica captures the look and feel perfectly while the original has decayed? In friendships, we value long history. But is that more important than present connection? The ship of Theseus reminds us that identity isn't always fixed. Sometimes it's a perception, a story we continue telling because it's useful, comforting, or necessary. Ultimately, this thought experiment reveals how complex and fragile the idea of sameness really is. We like to believe in clear definitions, that something is either original or not, real or fake, same or different. But life doesn't always work that way. Most things exist in a state of gradual transformation, and identity becomes a matter of perspective. Whether or not the ship is still Theseus's may not have a definitive answer, but asking the question helps us explore what we value: history, continuity, memory, purpose. And it quietly suggests that maybe we are all like that ship, changing, piece by piece, never exactly as we were, yet still somehow ourselves. Free will paradox. We often live with the assumption that we are in control of our actions. We choose what to eat, who to speak to, what to believe. Free will feels intuitive. It's the sense that our decisions are our own, shaped by thought, reflection, or instinct. But the more we explore this idea, the more fragile it becomes. The free will paradox begins with a simple but unsettling question. If every event in the universe is caused by what came before it, including every decision, every thought, every impulse, then where is the freedom in our choices? If our brains are physical systems following the laws of cause and effect, then aren't our actions just the result of prior conditions? And if they are, how can we truly be responsible for anything we do? This line of thought leads to determinism, the view that everything that happens is the inevitable outcome of previous states of the world. In a deterministic universe, even your belief in free will was determined before you were born. Every word you say, every decision you make, every habit you form, all of it is part of an unbroken chain stretching back through time. You may feel like you're choosing freely, but that feeling itself is just another link in the chain. This idea is deeply uncomfortable because it threatens the core of personal identity. If you didn't choose your personality, your desires, or your thoughts, if they were shaped by biology, upbringing, and environment, then in what sense are they truly yours? On the other hand, if we reject determinism and claim that our choices are not determined by prior causes, we face a different problem. If your actions are not caused by anything, not by your thoughts, not by your reasons, not by your character, then they become random, unanchored, arbitrary. But randomness is not freedom either. If your decisions happen without cause, then they're not really your choices. They're just spontaneous occurrences with no meaning. This is the paradox. If our actions are caused, they may not be free. But if they are uncaused, they still don't feel free. Either way, the foundation of free will seems to dissolve. Some philosophers have tried to resolve this by redefining what free will means. They argue that freedom isn't about escaping causality. It's about acting in accordance with your internal motivations, without external coercion. In this view, even if your thoughts and preferences are shaped by your past, you still have free will if your actions flow from your own reasoning and desires. This idea, known as compatibilism, tries to preserve moral responsibility in a deterministic world. It says, yes, your choices are influenced by causes, but as long as those causes include your values, your goals, your identity, then you are still free. It's a practical answer, one that allows society to function, but for many, it still feels like a compromise. The free will paradox forces us to confront something we rarely question: the nature of agency. We praise effort, condemn wrongdoing, admire discipline. All of these judgments rely on the idea that people are responsible for what they do. Without free will, the foundation of ethics, law, and even personal growth begins to shake. If no one truly chooses to be who they are, can they be blamed or praised for it? Should we still reward achievement or punish failure? And if we shouldn't, then how do we build meaning in a world where everything is just unfolding, step by step, like a script being read out loud? Despite these challenges, most people continue to live as if free will exists. We plan, regret, hope, forgive. We believe in change, in becoming better, in making different choices tomorrow than we did yesterday. The paradox doesn't necessarily stop us from living. Instead, it deepens our awareness of what it means to act, to decide, to take ownership of our lives. Perhaps free will isn't something we can prove or disprove, but something we choose to believe in. Not because it's logically airtight, but because without it, life loses its shape. Responsibility disappears. So we accept the contradiction, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. We live as if we are free, even as we acknowledge the possibility that we may not be. Russell's paradox. In a small town, there's a barber who shaves all those, and only those who do not shave themselves. It's a simple rule, or so it seems, until you ask the question, does the barber shave himself? If he does, then, by definition, he must not, because he only shaves those who don't shave themselves. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he must, because he shaves everyone who doesn't. The logic collapses on itself. This little riddle, seemingly just a funny brain teaser, is actually a simplified version of something far more profound: Russell's paradox. Formulated by philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell in 1901, it shook the foundations of mathematics and logic by exposing a contradiction at the heart of set theory, the very language used to build most of modern mathematics. At the core of the paradox is the idea of sets, collections of objects. Some sets are simple: the set of all cats, the set of all even numbers, the set of things that weigh more than a kilogram. But what about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves? That's where things get strange. If such a set exists, then we must ask, does it contain itself? If it does, then it shouldn't, because it only contains sets that do not contain themselves. But if it doesn't, then it should, because it qualifies as a set that does not contain itself. Either way, we arrive at a contradiction. A simple idea, defining a set in a particular way, leads to a logical impossibility. And just like that, the foundations of logic and mathematics began to tremble. Russell's discovery was more than a technical glitch. It exposed the limitations of formal systems and the danger of assuming that language, even precise mathematical language, always behaves the way we expect it to. Before this paradox, mathematicians believed that all valid sets could be freely defined, and that logic could be made completely consistent and complete. But with this contradiction, Russell showed that even the most fundamental structures could collapse under their own definitions. It wasn't just about one problematic example. It was a sign that something deeper was broken, that self-reference, when allowed freely, could introduce unavoidable contradictions into any logical system. In response, entire branches of mathematics had to be re-examined. Some systems introduced strict rules to prevent sets from containing themselves. Others created hierarchies of sets to block self-reference. These were not just mathematical adjustments, but philosophical ones. They reflected a shift in how we think about truth, structure, and the limits of abstraction. Russell's paradox doesn't just affect pure logic. It reaches into computer science, linguistics, and philosophy. Any system that uses self-reference, where something defines or includes itself, risks encountering similar contradictions. On a more human level, the paradox touches something familiar. We often define ourselves by what we are not. We create roles, identities, categories, only to find that the boundaries are more fragile than they appear. We say we are rational, but what happens when rationality leads to contradiction? We value clarity and structure, yet we sometimes rely on rules that undermine themselves. Russell's paradox is a reminder that even the most rigorous systems can become unstable when they turn inward, when they begin to describe themselves. Ultimately, the paradox doesn't have a clean resolution. It led to new foundations for mathematics, but the core insight remains unsettling. Some questions can't be answered within the system that asks them. Some definitions, no matter how carefully constructed, carry within them the seeds of collapse. And perhaps that's not a failure of thought, but a truth about the nature of thinking itself. Just as the barber cannot shave himself without creating a contradiction, some ideas cannot be held without slipping through the cracks of logic. Russell's paradox reminds us that even in the realm of pure reason, certainty has limits. And those limits are closer than we think. Paradox of tolerance. Tolerance is often seen as a virtue, a marker of open-mindedness, compassion, and respect for diversity. In a healthy society, people with different beliefs, cultures, and lifestyles should be able to coexist peacefully. But the paradox of tolerance raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when a tolerant society is confronted by intolerance? Should it tolerate those who do not believe in tolerance themselves? The paradox, introduced by philosopher Karl Popper in the mid-20th century, suggests that unlimited tolerance can lead to the disappearance of tolerance altogether. If a society allows intolerance to grow unchecked, if it tolerates hate, aggression, or extremism in the name of freedom, then over time, the intolerant can gain enough power to suppress the tolerant. In other words, if we tolerate everything, we risk losing the very conditions that make tolerance possible. This creates a moral and philosophical dilemma. On one hand, the value of tolerance lies in its universality, in the willingness to accept different perspectives, even those we disagree with. But on the other hand, some ideologies don't just disagree with others. They seek to eliminate them. If those ideologies are protected under the umbrella of tolerance, they may use that protection to grow stronger, until they are no longer interested in peaceful coexistence. At that point, tolerance becomes a vulnerability, not a strength. The very openness that defines it becomes the means of its own undoing. This is not just theory. History offers countless examples of societies where extremist movements gained power through democratic or open channels, only to dismantle those very systems once in control. In these cases, tolerance allowed intolerance to flourish. The question, then, is not whether tolerance is valuable, but whether it has limits. And if it does, where should those limits be drawn? Who decides what crosses the line between acceptable disagreement and dangerous ideology? And how do we prevent those decisions from becoming tools of censorship or oppression themselves? Some argue that the answer lies in distinguishing between opinion and action. People should be free to hold and express any belief, no matter how offensive or misguided, as long as it doesn't lead to harm. But what counts as harm? Is it only physical violence? What about incitement, dehumanization, or persistent attacks on the dignity of others? In an interconnected world, words have power. They shape norms, justify actions, and influence behaviors. Tolerating hate speech in the name of free expression can, over time, create an environment where actual violence becomes more likely, and so the paradox deepens. If we allow intolerant speech to spread unchecked, we may be silently enabling the conditions for intolerance to dominate. At the same time, enforcing limits on tolerance is not without risk. Once a society begins to restrict certain views, even with good intentions, it opens the door to potential abuse. Who gets to define what is intolerant? And what happens when those definitions shift with political winds? In trying to protect tolerance, we may accidentally erode freedom. The paradox forces us to walk a fine line, to defend openness without letting it be used as a weapon against itself. It asks us to be strong enough to say no when tolerance is being exploited, but also wise enough to avoid silencing legitimate dissent or unpopular thought. Ultimately, the paradox of tolerance is a warning, not against tolerance itself, but against naivety. It reminds us that values cannot survive on ideals alone. They require protection, boundaries, and sometimes difficult choices. A society committed to freedom, inclusion, and peace must also be willing to confront those who seek to destroy those principles. That doesn't mean becoming intolerant ourselves, but it does mean recognizing that not all ideas are equally harmless, and that defending tolerance may require refusing to tolerate its deliberate destruction. The paradox doesn't offer a simple rule, but it does offer clarity. Tolerance without limits isn't sustainable. And if we care about preserving an open, free society, then knowing when to draw the line becomes not a contradiction of tolerance, but its defense. The immortality paradox. Immortality is often imagined as the ultimate escape from fear, from decay, from the ticking of the clock. In mythologies, science fiction, and even real scientific speculation, living forever is portrayed as the final triumph of human will over nature. But beneath this appealing idea lies an uncomfortable paradox. What if living forever doesn't enhance life, but empties it of meaning? The immortality paradox challenges the assumption that a limitless lifespan would be a gift. It asks, if there is no end, can there truly be value in each moment? Can something still matter when it can be repeated endlessly? Part of what gives life its urgency is the awareness that it's limited. Decisions matter because we don't have infinite chances to make them. Relationships are cherished because we know they won't last forever. Even small moments, a conversation, a sunset, a quiet evening, feel significant because they are part of a finite collection. Mortality gives life structure. It creates a beginning, a middle, and an end. And within that structure, we search for meaning. But if we remove the end, if life becomes an unbroken continuation, what happens to that meaning? Would joy still feel like joy if it could be experienced again and again, without limit or loss? The paradox doesn't claim that death is better than life. Rather, it highlights a tension, that life gains intensity from its limits. Imagine achieving your dreams, wealth, love, success, and then realizing you have eternity left. After 1,000 years, then 10,000 more. What goals remain? What struggles still motivate you? Even pleasure, if stretched endlessly, can dull. Without contrast, without hardship, boredom, or finality, fulfillment starts to blur. Immortality promises everything, but risks delivering nothing that feels meaningful. Philosophers have debated whether the desire for immortality comes from a rational longing or from fear. Specifically, the fear of death. Some argue that our wish to live forever is rooted in avoiding loss, not in pursuing life. But when that fear is removed, when we imagine a world without death, new problems arise. If you can't die, can you still be brave? If there are no real consequences, can there still be real choices? Over time, existence may become a routine, not a journey. And the paradox becomes clear. What we wanted to preserve may be what we eventually lose, the depth and sharpness of being alive. This idea has been explored in countless stories, often portraying immortality not as a reward, but a curse. Eternal beings are shown as detached, weary, or numb, not because life is bad, but because endless life becomes indistinguishable from repetition. Human emotions, ambitions, and relationships are all shaped by the knowledge that time is running out. Immortality takes that away. Without death, time becomes a flat line instead of a rising and falling curve. There is no climax, no conclusion, just more time, endlessly extending forward. There are, of course, counter-arguments. Some suggest that with infinite time, we could pursue endless growth, learn every language, master every skill, explore every idea. But the paradox remains. Growth implies a direction, a sense of progress. If time never runs out, that direction can vanish. Goals lose urgency. Experiences lose contrast. Even love might feel diluted if you know it can't be lost. Scarcity, it turns out, isn't always a limitation. Sometimes, it's what makes things feel real. Ultimately, the immortality paradox isn't meant to dismiss the value of life, or the dream of extending it. It's meant to remind us that part of what makes life meaningful is precisely that it ends. It's the boundary that gives shape to the story. Without that boundary, we risk drifting. Not just in time, but in purpose. The paradox challenges us to rethink what we truly want when we say we want to live forever. Is it really time we're after? Or is it something deeper? Presence, connection, meaning. All of which may depend not on how long we live, but on knowing that life, because it ends, truly matters. Bootstrap paradox. A scientist travels back in time, carrying with them a copy of Beethoven's sheet music. In the past, they meet the young composer, who has yet to write a single note. Impressed by the pages, Beethoven studies the music and later publishes it as his own. Generations pass. The same sheet music is discovered, preserved, and eventually handed down until it ends up in the hands of that very same scientist, who takes it back in time again. This closed loop raises a disturbing question. Where did the music come from? If Beethoven learned it from the scientist, and the scientist learned it from Beethoven, then who actually created it? That's the bootstrap paradox, a loop of causality, where an object, idea, or piece of information exists without a clear point of origin. It was never created. It just exists, cycling through time. At first, the paradox sounds like a clever science fiction plot, but beneath the story lies a deep challenge to how we understand cause and effect. In everyday life, we assume that every effect has a cause, that things begin somewhere, even if we don't know exactly where. But the bootstrap paradox breaks this expectation. It creates an event that sustains itself without any external input, and that idea is deeply unsettling, because if something can exist without a beginning, then the entire chain of causality we rely on, from physical laws to personal decisions, becomes questionable. The paradox gets its name from the old phrase, pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, which refers to doing something impossible, like lifting yourself into the air by tugging on your own shoes. In the same way, a bootstrap paradox describes something that exists, seemingly by pulling itself into existence. There's no first cause, no origin point, no external explanation, just a loop, neat, self-contained, and logically baffling. It's often used to highlight the problems that arise in time travel stories, where characters interact with the past in ways that affect the future, which in turn becomes their own past. But the implications go far beyond fiction. In a bootstrap, loop, the boundary between creator and receiver disappears. A book is written by someone who read it. A machine is built by someone who saw its design in the future. A discovery is made by someone who never actually discovered it. This challenges not only causality, but also ideas like authorship, ownership, and originality. How can something be credited to anyone if it was never created in the first place? And what does it mean for knowledge, if it can circulate without ever being discovered, only passed along? Some theories of time travel try to make room for these loops by accepting them as self-consistent. According to the Novikov self-consistency principle, events in time are fixed in such a way that paradoxes cannot occur, even if they appear strange. Under this view, the loop isn't a contradiction. It's just part of a larger, consistent timeline where everything fits together perfectly. But many find this explanation unsatisfying. It solves the logical issue by redefining what's acceptable, not by explaining where the thing actually came from. It asks us to accept that something can exist in a causal loop forever, without ever being created, and simply not ask further questions. The bootstrap paradox also raises philosophical questions about meaning. In a world where things can exist, without origin, what happens to the concept of purpose? We often assign value to things based on where they come from, who made them, how they were developed, what problem they were meant to solve. But in a bootstrap loop, that context vanishes. The object or idea becomes detached from intention. It's not the result of progress, need, or creativity. It just is, and that can make it feel hollow, even if it functions perfectly. Ultimately, the bootstrap paradox reminds us how fragile our understanding of causality really is. We build stories, histories, and explanations on the assumption that things begin somewhere, that events follow one another in a clear linear path. But time, as a concept, doesn't always cooperate. The paradox doesn't offer a solution. It offers a confrontation with the limits of logic, a quiet suggestion that maybe, just maybe, not everything needs an origin to exist. And if that's true, then what else might be circling through our world? Unexplained, uncreated, but real. All the same, paradox of self-knowledge. We often assume that knowing ourselves is not only possible, but necessary. Know thyself has been a guiding principle in philosophy for thousands of years. It's the foundation of personal growth, emotional intelligence, and ethical decision-making. But the paradox of self-knowledge introduces a complication. The moment you attempt to observe yourself, your thoughts, your motives, your nature, the very act of observation alters what you're trying to understand. If you're trying to see your true self, but the self you're observing is already changed by the fact that you're watching it, then can you ever truly know who you are? The paradox is rooted in a familiar phenomenon. We behave differently when we know we're being watched. Our posture changes, our words become more careful, our decisions more calculated. But what happens when the one doing the watching is you? Self-awareness introduces a kind of internal surveillance, and, with it, self-modification. You start thinking not just about how you feel, but about how your feelings appear to you. You start asking why you made a choice, and in doing so, you reinterpret the memory, reshaping it to make sense. The more you try to observe yourself objectively, the more you influence what you're observing. This creates a loop that is difficult to escape. You want to be honest with yourself, but total honesty requires objectivity. And objectivity requires distance. But how can you be distant from yourself? You are the subject and the object of your analysis. No external vantage point exists. Every attempt to gain insight into your own mind is filtered through that same mind, full of its biases, blind spots, and desires. This doesn't mean self-knowledge is impossible, but it does mean it may never be complete. You can know parts of yourself, but perhaps never the whole, because the whole includes the part of you that is doing the knowing. Some philosophers compare this to looking into a mirror that bends slightly with each glance. You see a version of yourself, familiar, recognizable, but never quite exact. Others draw parallels to quantum mechanics, where observing a particle changes its behavior. In the same way, introspection changes the mental state being examined. Even psychological tools like journaling or therapy, while incredibly valuable, operate within this paradox. They help clarify thoughts and patterns, but the clarity they produce is not raw, untouched truth. It is a version shaped by attention, language, and reflection. The paradox raises deeper questions about authenticity. If every version of yourself you identify is shaped by the act of identification, then which version is real? The impulsive reaction before analysis? The thoughtful revision after reflection? Or neither? It also challenges the idea of personal consistency. We often speak of finding ourselves, as though there is a fixed, stable identity hidden beneath the noise of daily life. But what if the self is not a singular thing to be uncovered, but a shifting process, shaped by time, context, and the act of searching itself? In some ways, the paradox of self-knowledge is not a flaw in human thinking, but a reflection of what it means to be human. We are not static objects. We are fluid, responsive beings. We reflect and we change as a result of that reflection. The paradox doesn't negate the value of introspection. In fact, it may enhance it. It invites humility, reminding us that self-knowledge is not a final destination, but an ongoing relationship. We don't solve ourselves like a puzzle. We observe, adapt, and grow. And in doing so, we become different from who we were. Ultimately, the paradox reveals that to know oneself is to change oneself. And to change is to lose the very moment you were trying to capture. But that doesn't mean the effort is meaningless. It means the effort is alive. Self-knowledge is not a perfect mirror. It's a moving current. And maybe what matters most is not achieving a flawless reflection, but choosing to look anyway. To engage with the mystery, knowing that the answer may always be just beyond reach, but that the reaching itself is part of who you are. Self-sabotage paradox. People often say they want to succeed, to grow, to improve, to be better. They set goals, make plans, and take steps toward progress. But strangely, many of those same people act in ways that directly conflict with what they claim to want. They procrastinate before important tasks. They push away opportunities. They sabotage relationships or routines just as they begin to show promise. This is the self-sabotage paradox. The idea that a person can consciously desire success while unconsciously working against it. The paradox lies in the contradiction between intention and action. Why would someone who fears failure create the very conditions that lead to it? At first glance, this behavior seems irrational, but it often serves a deeper psychological purpose. For some, the fear of failing after giving their full effort is more painful than the failure itself. If you try your hardest and still come up short, you face the possibility that you're not good enough. That kind of truth can feel unbearable. But if you never fully try, if you hold something back, you preserve the comforting illusion that success was always within reach, if only you'd really committed. In this way, self-sabotage becomes a strange form of self-protection. It offers an excuse, a buffer, a way to avoid confronting a painful reality. There's also the fear of change itself. Success often demands transformation of habits, identity, relationships, or expectations. And transformation, even when positive, can feel threatening. If you've always seen yourself as someone who struggles, who's overlooked, who stays in the background, then stepping into a version of yourself that's visible, competent, or in control can feel disorienting. People sometimes cling to old patterns, not because they work, but because they're familiar. In that sense, self-sabotage preserves a kind of identity stability. The discomfort of failure is outweighed by the comfort of predictability. This paradox reveals how complex human motivation really is. We are not purely logical beings who pursue goals in a straight line. We are layered, shaped by past experiences, unconscious beliefs, and emotional memory. Someone who was once punished for standing out may now fear visibility. Someone who grew up with unpredictable support may doubt whether good things will last. These patterns don't disappear just because a new goal is set. Often they reappear right when progress begins, like a hidden reflex pulling us back from something we claim to want. Another layer of the paradox is control. Failure that comes from sabotage is still failure, but it's failure on your own terms. There's a strange kind of power in choosing your downfall. It feels better to trip yourself than to be pushed. In this way, self-sabotage creates the illusion of control in a situation where uncertainty might otherwise feel overwhelming. The person isn't avoiding failure. They're controlling the timing and shape of it. That small illusion can feel safer than the vulnerability of hope. Recognizing the paradox doesn't always prevent it. Often, self-sabotage operates beneath awareness. It shows up in rationalizations, I'll start tomorrow. I'm not ready yet. It probably wouldn't work anyway. These thoughts seem harmless on the surface, but repeated often enough, they erode action. The real danger is not in the dramatic act of destruction, but in the quiet accumulation of delay, hesitation, and doubt. Over time, these patterns solidify, and the person becomes stuck, not because they lack potential, but because their fear was louder than their desire. Breaking the paradox requires more than motivation. It requires self-honesty. It means asking not just what you want, but what you're afraid of. What success would demand from you. What failure would confirm about you. And whether you're truly willing to let go of the identity that sabotage helps protect. It's uncomfortable work, but necessary. Because until the inner conflict is addressed, the same cycle tends to repeat, wanting more, but undermining the path to get there. Ultimately, the self-sabotage paradox is not a flaw of character. It's a reflection of human complexity, of how fear and desire can coexist, of how progress threatens comfort, and of how people sometimes hurt themselves not because they want to, but because staying the same feels safer than the risk of becoming something new. The paradox doesn't ask whether you want success. It asks whether you're willing to face what success would demand from you, and whether you're ready to stop stepping in your own way. Self-improvement paradox. Self-improvement is often seen as one of the most admirable goals a person can have. To strive to be better, smarter, healthier, kinder, more productive, is framed as a mark of strength and responsibility. Entire industries are built around it. Books, courses, routines, philosophies. But at the heart of this pursuit lies a quiet contradiction. The self-improvement paradox asks, if you're constantly trying to improve yourself, doesn't that imply you're never good enough as you are? And if you're never good enough, can any amount of self-improvement ever truly satisfy you? The very act of reaching for a better version of yourself can reinforce the belief that who you are now is fundamentally insufficient. This creates a psychological loop that's easy to fall into. You set a goal, to wake up earlier, to be more focused, to eat better, to read more. At first, the effort feels empowering, but soon the process becomes endless. Once one goal is met, another appears. You may be fitter, more organized, more knowledgeable, but the feeling of satisfaction is short-lived. There's always a new version of better just out of reach. Improvement becomes not a means to peace, but a constant reminder of everything you are not yet. Instead of building confidence, the pursuit quietly amplifies self-doubt. This isn't to say growth is a problem. Change is natural, and striving can be healthy. But the paradox arises when the motivation for self-improvement is rooted in the belief that you're not enough right now. If every attempt to grow is driven by a subtle rejection of the present self, then growth becomes a form of self-rejection dressed up as ambition. It can lead to perfectionism, chronic dissatisfaction, and even burnout. Not because the goals are too big, but because the foundation they rest on is unstable. Another layer of the paradox is identity. The more you focus on becoming someone else, a more successful, more disciplined, more likable version of yourself, the more disconnected you can feel from who you actually are. In trying to become your ideal self, you risk losing touch with your real self. Improvement becomes performance. Instead of living authentically, you're constantly measuring, adjusting, optimizing. Life becomes a checklist, and rest feels like regression. There's also a cultural component. In many societies, especially modern and hyper-connected ones, self-improvement isn't just encouraged, it's expected. People are told they should always be upgrading something about themselves, doing more, earning more, improving more. In this context, staying still, even briefly, can feel like failure. But this pressure can make it hard to distinguish between growth that's meaningful and growth that's compulsive. Are you learning something because it excites you, or because you feel behind? Are you working on yourself because it brings joy, or because you're afraid of being judged for standing still? Breaking the paradox doesn't mean rejecting growth altogether. It means shifting the motivation behind it. Instead of improving to escape who you are, what if you improved because you already value yourself? What if growth came from a place of curiosity rather than shame? The goal isn't to abandon change, but to detach it from the need to prove worth. Self-improvement, at its healthiest, isn't about chasing a better self out of self-hate. It's about expanding your capacity to experience, contribute, and understand, without treating your current self as a problem that needs fixing. Ultimately, the self-improvement paradox invites us to reframe progress. To ask whether the path we're on is actually taking us somewhere we want to go, or just keeping us too busy to ask why we're walking in the first place. It's not a rejection of ambition, but a reminder that the pursuit of better should not come at the cost of peace. Because if we can't value who we are now, no version of the future will ever feel complete. And maybe real growth begins, not when we reject who we are, but when we choose to care for ourselves as we are, and build from there. The experience paradox. We often think of life as a series of experiences, moments that shape us, move us, define us, vacations, relationships, achievements, losses. But if we look closer, another question begins to emerge. Do we live for the experience itself or for the memory of it? This is the experience paradox. The idea that what matters most may not be what we are doing in the moment, but how we will later remember having done it. In other words, the act of experiencing and the act of remembering are not always aligned, and sometimes the pursuit of a meaningful memory can come at the cost of a meaningful moment. This paradox becomes clear in everyday situations. A person visits a breathtaking location, a beach, a mountain, a city, and instinctively pulls out their phone to capture the scene. In doing so, their attention shifts. They are no longer immersed in the view, but thinking about how it will look in a photo, how it will be shared, how it will be remembered. They are half present. The moment is being experienced with one eye, on the future, not on how it feels, but on how it will be told. And yet, this isn't shallow or vain. It's a reflection of something deeper. That memory has become a second form of living, a kind of personal archive that often holds more emotional weight than the moment itself. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman distinguished between two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives through time. It feels pain, joy, boredom, hunger. But the remembering self tells the story. And it is the remembering self that makes our decisions, sets our goals, and defines what we call a good life. When we look back, we don't recall entire stretches of time. We recall highlights, endings, moments that stood out. A 2-week vacation with 13 average days and one amazing day is often remembered more fondly than a consistently pleasant trip with no standout peak. Memory compresses experience, and in doing so, reshapes how we evaluate life. This creates attention. If we live only in the moment, we may have rich, full experiences that fade quickly, leaving little behind. But if we live primarily for memory, for what can be saved, shown, or retold, we risk missing the depth of presence. The paradox is that chasing memorable experiences can pull us away from experiencing them. Planning the perfect proposal, the ideal trip, or the flawless celebration often becomes more about future reflection than present immersion. We script life not to feel it now, but to remember it later. There's also a subtler layer to the paradox. We edit our memories. Over time, we alter the story, sometimes softening it, sometimes sharpening it, sometimes even changing its meaning. And because those edited memories influence our sense of identity, we begin to relate more to a version of the past that may no longer resemble what really happened. Our present decisions are shaped by recollections that were already distortions to begin with. We experience, we remember, and then we live according to those memories, even if they're no longer accurate reflections of reality. None of this means memory is bad or that seeking meaningful moments is a mistake, but the paradox challenges us to consider how often we trade real experience for the idea of one. Do we laugh because something is funny, or because it'll sound funny in a story later? Do we enjoy something because we're present, or because it looks good in hindsight? These questions aren't about guilt. They're about awareness. They invite us to recognize that memory and experience are not the same, and that prioritizing one too much may cause the other to slip away unnoticed. Ultimately, the experience. Paradox reminds us that living fully may require accepting that not every moment will be remembered, and that not every memory reflects what was actually felt. Presence and reflection will always be in tension, but perhaps balance lies in choosing when to let go of the narrative, when to stop curating the future, and when to simply be. Because life, at its core, isn't just what we remember. It's what happens while we're busy trying to remember it. The hedonic treadmill. People often believe that happiness lies just beyond the next achievement. A better job, a higher income, a new relationship, a bigger home. And for a while, when those goals are reached, happiness does seem to rise. But then, something strange happens. The excitement fades. The new becomes normal. The baseline returns. This cycle plays out again and again, and it's the foundation of the hedonic treadmill, also known as the happiness paradox. It suggests that no matter what we gain, our level of happiness tends to return to a relatively stable point. Like a treadmill, we run forward but stay in the same place. Progress happens, but satisfaction doesn't accumulate. The paradox lies in the disconnect between effort and emotional return. We strive, believing that improvement will lead to lasting joy. And yet, the joy is often short-lived. This isn't because the accomplishments are meaningless. Many are genuinely valuable. But our minds adapt. What once felt extraordinary becomes ordinary. The raise that once felt like a breakthrough becomes the new financial baseline. The apartment that once felt luxurious becomes simply home. This process, called hedonic adaptation, is part of how our brains work. It helps us survive change and normalize new conditions. But it also means that satisfaction is more fleeting than we expect. What makes this cycle difficult is that it's invisible while we're in it. We think the next thing will be different, that this time, the upgrade, the success, the relationship will bring lasting change. And when it doesn't, we don't question the pattern. We just set a new goal. The treadmill keeps moving. But instead of feeling like we're chasing a lie, it feels like we're just not running fast enough. So we push harder, expecting the next milestone to deliver what the last one didn't. This doesn't mean progress is meaningless, but it does raise the question, what are we really chasing? If happiness always resets, then is the pursuit flawed? Or are we simply misunderstanding what happiness is? The hedonic treadmill suggests that happiness, at least in the long term, might not come from external change, but from internal habits, from how we interpret events, relate to others, and find meaning. It challenges the assumption that more will make us feel better, and instead asks whether better might come from appreciating what's already here. It also challenges the way society defines success. In many cultures, ambition is encouraged as a path to fulfillment. Productivity, achievement, and accumulation are praised as signs of a good life. But if those things don't change our happiness in a lasting way, what then? Are we investing our time, energy, and identity into goals that cannot deliver what we expect? Or are we mistaking temporary pleasure for lasting contentment? There's a subtle danger in this paradox. It can lead to cynicism, the belief that nothing matters because everything fades. But that's not the lesson here. The point isn't to stop growing or setting goals. It's to understand the nature of how happiness works. The hedonic treadmill doesn't mean you can't feel joy. It means that joy doesn't come with permanent upgrades. It comes in moments, often small, often quiet, and those moments aren't always tied to achievement. They come from connection, from presence, from values that don't shift with each accomplishment. Recognizing the treadmill doesn't mean getting off it entirely. Life will always have goals, ambitions, and desires, but it does mean stepping back to ask what you're really after, and whether you're already running faster than necessary. Sometimes, the path to peace isn't acceleration, but awareness. Because if you never pause to appreciate where you are, You may spend your whole life running toward a version of happiness that's always just a little bit ahead of you. Abilene paradox. A family sits around the table on a hot summer afternoon in Texas. Someone casually suggests driving to Abilene, a city miles away, in the heat for dinner. No one really wants to go, but each person, assuming the others are interested, agrees. They pile into the car, endure the long, uncomfortable drive, eat mediocre food, and return exhausted. Only afterward does someone finally admit, "I didn't actually want to go." One by one, the others agree. None of them wanted to go, yet all of them went. This is the Abilene paradox, named after this real anecdote. It describes a situation where a group of people collectively decide on a course of action that none of them actually want, simply because each person wrongly believes that the others do. At its core, the paradox reveals how people can act against their own preferences, values, and comfort out of a desire to avoid conflict or maintain harmony. In trying to be agreeable, they betray their own judgment. Ironically, the group ends up united in quiet discomfort, each believing they are the only one who feels that way. No one speaks up, not because they agree, but because they assume agreement already exists. The silence becomes misread as consensus, and consensus becomes action. The result is a group doing something that nobody truly supports, not because of manipulation or pressure, but because of mutual misperception. What makes the Abilene paradox so striking is how common it is. In families, teams, workplaces, even entire institutions, people regularly go along with decisions they privately disagree with. They nod, smile, participate, all while carrying quiet doubts or frustration. Sometimes it's out of politeness. Other times it's fear of judgment, conflict, or being labeled difficult. But over time, this pattern corrodes trust. People feel unheard, even when they never try to speak. They feel resentful of decisions they helped enable. And the worst part is, everyone might be feeling the same thing, silently. This paradox exposes a fundamental flaw in group communication, the assumption that silence equals agreement. In reality, silence often masks hesitation, doubt, or passive resistance. When no one is willing to be the first to speak up, bad ideas gain momentum. And the longer the false consensus holds, the harder it becomes to challenge. It's not just about one bad decision, it becomes a culture. A group may pride itself on teamwork, but if everyone is pretending, that teamwork is an illusion. The Abilene paradox also highlights the tension between belonging and authenticity. Humans are social creatures. We seek connection and fear exclusion. Speaking against the group carries risk, the risk of standing out, being misunderstood, or causing discomfort. So we stay quiet, rationalizing our silence as being supportive, or not making a fuss. But in doing so, we remove the one thing that could prevent misalignment: honesty. It's a paradox where everyone loses, and everyone thinks they're the only one who feels out of place. Escaping the paradox doesn't require dramatic rebellion. It requires small acts of candor. Someone asking, "Do we really want this?" Or saying, "I'm not sure this is the right direction." These simple statements create space for others to express themselves. Often, it only takes one honest voice to break the illusion of agreement. And when that happens, the group shifts from polite compliance to genuine dialogue. True collaboration isn't about avoiding discomfort. It's about trusting that honesty won't break the group, but strengthen it. Ultimately, the Abilene paradox reminds us how easily people can misread each other, and how costly that misunderstanding can be. It asks us to consider whether our agreements are real or just carefully maintained illusions, whether our silence is consent or quiet self-betrayal, and whether we're going along with something not because we believe in it, but because we're afraid to say we don't. The path to clarity often begins with one question: is this what we all actually want? And sometimes, the most courageous thing a person can do is simply say, "I'd rather not go." Zeno's paradoxes, Zeno of Elea, a Greek philosopher from the 5th century before Common Era, posed a series of paradoxes that, at first glance, seem absurd. But they challenge some of our most basic intuitions about movement, time, and space. The most famous involves a race between Achilles, the fastest man in Greece, and a slow-moving tortoise. To make it fair, the tortoise is given a head start. Once the race begins, Achilles quickly reaches the point where the tortoise started. But in that time, the tortoise has moved forward a bit. So Achilles must now reach that new point. But again, the tortoise has advanced. And so on. No matter how fast Achilles runs, Zeno argues, he must always first reach where the tortoise has just been, meaning he can never actually overtake it. Of course, in reality, Achilles does overtake the tortoise. We see it happen. But Zeno's logic isn't about physical races. It's about the structure of time and space. He's pointing out that between any 2 points in space, there are an infinite number of midpoints. And if movement requires passing through each of them, then motion seems impossible. Not practically, but logically. You can't finish traversing an infinite number of points in a finite time, can you? That's the heart of the paradox. Motion appears real, but under scrutiny, it seems to collapse into contradiction. Zeno offered other versions too, like the arrow paradox, where an arrow in flight is actually motionless at every single instant of time. If time is made up of frozen moments, and in each moment the arrow occupies a fixed position, then how is motion possible at all? Zeno's goal wasn't to deny motion outright, but to expose how our understanding of continuity, infinity, and time might be flawed. He challenged the assumption that space and time can be broken into endlessly divisible parts without consequence, and even now, centuries later, we're still wrestling with those questions. Modern mathematics and physics offer ways to resolve the paradox, primarily through the concept of limits. In calculus, we understand that the sum of infinitely many, decreasing numbers can still be finite. Achilles doesn't have to complete an infinite task. He simply moves through smaller and smaller distances, which together add up to a finite stretch. But even with this mathematical solution, the paradox lingers, because while math may resolve the numbers, the intuition Zeno disrupts remains deeply human. He reveals a tension between how we experience the world and how we try to explain it. The paradox also reflects a deeper psychological truth. Often in life, we face goals that seem just out of reach, and every time we get closer, the goal moves slightly ahead. Like Achilles chasing the tortoise, we feel progress without completion. It shows up in creative work, in self-improvement, in personal dreams. You reach a milestone, only to realize there's another one waiting. The horizon stretches endlessly forward, and satisfaction always seems to require one more step. Zeno's paradox becomes a metaphor for the frustration of infinite progress, always moving, never arriving. There's also a philosophical layer about perception. We trust our senses. We see motion. We feel it. We move through space. But Zeno asks, what if your senses are lying? What if the systems you use to understand the world, logic, observation, reason, are in conflict with one another? What do you trust then? The paradox invites humility. It reminds us that just because something feels obvious doesn't mean it's logically sound, and just because something seems impossible on paper doesn't mean it can't happen in reality. In the end, Zeno's paradoxes don't break physics. They illuminate its boundaries. They remind us that beneath the familiar flow of time and movement lies a web of assumptions, models, and fragile intuitions. We believe we understand motion because we live inside it. But understanding and experiencing are not the same. The paradox isn't meant to be solved easily. It's meant to shift our perspective, to make us pause and question the things we take most for granted: space, time, movement, and even the simple act of taking one step forward. The ego paradox: many people seek to let go of their ego, to become more humble, more self-aware, more grounded. It's seen as a noble pursuit, especially in the worlds of personal development, mindfulness, or spirituality. But the deeper this pursuit goes, the more it reveals a quiet contradiction. This is the ego paradox. The very act of trying to overcome the ego can itself become an act of ego, the desire to be egoless, to rise above pride, identity, and self-centeredness, can turn into a subtle form of superiority. The ego doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hides inside the whisper of self-improvement. The paradox begins with good intentions. A person wants to be less reactive, less attached to status, more connected to others. So they begin to meditate, to study, to reflect. Progress is made, but soon a thought appears. I'm becoming better. I'm growing. I'm more aware than I used to be. At first it seems harmless, even encouraging, but slowly the sense of progress begins to reshape identity. I am someone who has transcended ego. That self-image, while built on the idea of humility, starts to feel quietly elevated. And in that moment, the ego has returned, wearing the mask of its own absence. This isn't just a spiritual issue. It shows up in everyday self-improvement too. Someone starts reading more, exercising, building discipline. Over time, they begin to feel proud of who they're becoming. And in that pride, a subtle distance grows between them and others. I'm not like those who aren't working on themselves. Improvement becomes identity. And identity, even when built on positive change, becomes another structure the ego can hide inside. What was once a tool for growth now serves as a platform for quiet comparison. The ego doesn't always seek attention or admiration in obvious ways. Sometimes it expresses itself through control, through the desire to fix oneself completely, to be free from flaws. But that desire itself can become a kind of perfectionism, rooted in the fear of being ordinary or incomplete. Wanting to be free of ego can, ironically, stem from the ego's refusal to accept that it will never fully disappear. The pursuit of egolessness turns into another goal to achieve, another standard to meet, and the ego thrives in that chase. The ego paradox is difficult to detect because it often wears the language of wisdom. A person might speak of surrender, acceptance, or inner peace, but the way they speak about it reveals something else. I have let go. I understand what others don't. This creates a quiet hierarchy where egoless people see themselves as more evolved. But real humility doesn't come from the belief that one has no ego. It comes from recognizing that the ego is always nearby, always shifting, always adapting, and that no state of mind is ever final. This paradox also exposes the danger of turning identity into performance. When the ego is tied to being spiritual or kind or mindful, people may begin to act out those qualities to maintain the image, not because they truly feel them, but because they fear losing the sense of self those traits support. The mask becomes so convincing even the wearer forgets it's there. But deep down, the fear remains. If I'm not this version of myself, then what am I? So how do we navigate this? The answer may lie not in trying to destroy the ego, but in becoming aware of its many disguises. To see that ego doesn't vanish with insight, it evolves. And the goal isn't to escape it entirely, but to build a relationship with it that's based on awareness rather than denial. Instead of chasing the image of a perfected self, we can stay open to the reality of being in process, flawed, reactive, sometimes self-centered, and still worthy of reflection and growth. In the end, the ego paradox is not a warning to abandon the path of self-awareness. It's a reminder that even on that path, the ego walks with us. Not always loudly, not always clearly, but it's there. And maybe the most honest thing we can do is not claim to have left it behind, but to say, I see you. I know you're part of this, and I'm willing to keep walking anyway. Jealousy paradox. Jealousy is one of the most deeply human emotions, instinctive, uncomfortable, and often uninvited. It usually surfaces where there's love, attachment, or the fear of losing something we value. In relationships, jealousy is often framed as a sign of care. If you're jealous, it must mean you love someone, but that assumption hides a paradox. The jealousy paradox asks, if you truly love someone, don't you want them to be free? But if you want to possess them, to control their attention, to guard their affection. Is that still love? Or is it fear disguised as love? The paradox lies in the tension between love and possession. Love, at its best, is generous. It wants the other person to thrive, to choose you freely, to live fully. But jealousy is rooted in threat, the fear that someone else might take what you value. And when that fear becomes intense, it can turn love into something restrictive. You might begin to monitor, question, or withdraw, not out of malice, but out of insecurity. The more you try to hold on tightly, the more you risk pushing the person away. What begins as care slowly shifts into control, even if that control is emotional, quiet, or internal. This is where the paradox deepens. To truly love someone is to want their happiness, even if that happiness might one day lead them away from you. But the jealous mind resists that. It wants guarantees. It wants certainty. It wants to eliminate every possible threat, which is impossible. So instead, it tightens its grip, demands reassurances, or retreats into resentment. The emotion that started from connection ends up creating distance. Jealousy tries to protect love, but often does so in a way that damages the very thing it's trying to protect. What makes jealousy so difficult is that it's not entirely irrational. We live in a world where relationships can end, where attention shifts, where people grow apart. So the fear is real, but the response can be self-defeating. Jealousy doesn't usually strengthen bonds. It makes the other person feel trapped, distrusted, or suffocated. And yet, letting go, giving your partner freedom, trusting their choices, feels terrifying. It feels like opening the door and risking that they'll walk through it. But that's exactly what love asks for: trust without control. There's also a personal side to jealousy. Often, it doesn't come from what the other person is doing. It comes from how we see ourselves. If you feel unworthy, insecure, or easily replaced, then any outside attention your partner receives can feel like a threat. But the problem isn't really them. It's the silent belief that you're not enough, and no amount of reassurance can fully resolve that. It has to be addressed internally, not externally. Otherwise, you're asking your partner to constantly fill a gap that only self-understanding can close. The jealousy paradox forces us to examine what we mean when we say, "I love you." Is it love for the person, their uniqueness, their agency, their full self? Or is it love for the way they make us feel, the role they play in our lives, the validation they provide? If it's the latter, then jealousy will always be close by, because the focus is not on the other, but on what we fear losing. But if it's the former, if love is truly for them, then their freedom becomes part of the love, not a threat to it. This doesn't mean jealousy is always toxic or avoidable. It's a natural human emotion. But the paradox invites us to question how we respond to it. Do we act from it? Do we let it shape our behavior? Or do we acknowledge it, sit with it, and try to understand what it's really pointing to? Jealousy can be a signal, not of what's wrong in a relationship, but of what's unresolved in ourselves. In the end, the jealousy paradox reminds us that love is not about possession, and freedom is not the opposite of commitment. The person who stays with you freely is choosing you, and that choice means more than any control ever could. Trying to eliminate every risk only creates more. Trust doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means choosing not to let fear decide how we love. And perhaps real love begins when we stop gripping tightly, not because we don't care, but because we care enough to let someone be fully themselves. Trust paradox. Trust is something we all say we value. It's the foundation of relationships, communities, and even personal peace of mind. But the moment we try to prove it, to measure it, to test it, to guarantee it, it starts to fall apart. This is the trust paradox. Trust only functions when it's freely given, not when it's forced, verified, or constantly checked. The more you try to secure trust, the less real it becomes. And in trying to make it certain, you might destroy it altogether. This paradox shows up most clearly in relationships. When you trust someone, you accept a degree of vulnerability. You believe they won't betray you, not because you've proven it, but because you've chosen to believe it. But that belief is fragile. When doubt creeps in, it's tempting to start looking for confirmation. You ask questions, you double-check their actions, you look for clues, and maybe you find nothing, or maybe you find something that only deepens your suspicion. Suddenly, you're not building trust, you're tracking behavior. What was once based on openness has turned into surveillance. The paradox is that this kind of checking feels reasonable. After all, people do make mistakes. They do lie. Isn't it wise to protect yourself? But the problem is that real trust requires a leap, a conscious decision to accept uncertainty. If you need absolute proof that someone will never hurt you, you'll never be able to trust them, because that proof doesn't exist. And in the process of trying to eliminate risk, you may behave in ways that create distance, resentment, or exactly the kind of disconnection you were afraid of in the first place. This isn't just personal. It shows up in professional environments, too. A manager who truly trusts their team allows autonomy, but a manager who constantly checks, monitors, and second-guesses may believe they're being thorough, when in reality, they're signaling distrust. And over time, people respond to that signal. They stop sharing openly. They become guarded. Trust doesn't grow from fear of being caught. It grows from the sense that you're believed in, even when no one's watching. The paradox also applies in reverse. Being trusted by someone else carries a weight. It makes you want to live up to their belief in you, not out of fear, but out of respect. When someone gives you their trust without demanding reassurance, it invites you to be worthy of it. But if that same person constantly questions you, demands evidence, or doubts your intentions, you may begin to feel like no amount of honesty will ever be enough. Eventually, you stop trying. And so trust is not just a gift, it's a responsibility, but it only works when it's offered freely. What makes this paradox so difficult is that trust is often fragile and it can be broken, so the instinct to protect ourselves is valid. We've all been let down, misled, or blindsided. The idea of trusting again, fully, openly, can feel naive. But the paradox forces us to ask, what's the alternative? A life where no one is trusted, where every connection is conditional and every interaction is tested. That may feel safer, but it's also lonelier. And over time, it creates more isolation than it prevents. Trust is not the absence of doubt. It's choosing not to let doubt control your behavior. It's not blind optimism. It's the quiet decision to risk disappointment in exchange for real connection. That risk is what gives trust its value. Without it, trust would mean nothing. If you knew with certainty that someone could never hurt or disappoint you, trusting them wouldn't be noble. It would be automatic. The beauty of trust is that it's given when there's still a chance it could be broken. Ultimately, the trust paradox reminds us that some of the most important things in life don't become stronger by being tested. They become weaker. Love, loyalty, honesty, these thrive when they're assumed, not demanded. When we stop trying to lock down trust like a contract, we allow it to grow like a relationship. And maybe the most powerful trust isn't the one we can prove, but the one we choose, even when we could doubt. Fast life paradox. Modern life moves fast. We scroll, swipe, multitask, chase deadlines, and optimize every corner of the day. Speed is seen as progress. Faster communication, faster transportation, faster learning. But somewhere along the way, a strange paradox emerges. The faster life moves, the less of it we seem to feel. This is the fast life paradox. The idea that in trying to fit more into each moment, we risk feeling less connected to any of it. Days become a blur. Moments become tasks. And though everything is accelerating, we begin to feel like we're just skimming across the surface of our own lives, never fully sinking into anything. The paradox lies in how our pursuit of efficiency begins to undercut experience. We move quickly so we can do more. But in doing more, we give less attention to each thing. A conversation becomes a background activity. A meal becomes an interruption. A walk becomes a way to catch up on emails or podcasts. In theory, we're being productive. But emotionally, mentally, even physically, we're disengaging. And this disengagement has a cost. It leaves behind a sense of flatness, as if time is slipping by, but not quite being lived. The mind is busy, but the soul feels untouched. This isn't just a personal feeling. It's a cultural shift. Entire industries are built on saving time, on speeding up experience. Instant messages replace letters. Highlight reels replace full memories. Life is packaged into short bursts, headlines, stories, updates, each demanding attention, none offering depth. We consume constantly, but reflect rarely, and so time feels like it's flying, not because it's actually faster, but because we're less anchored in it. Moments pass unmarked. Days vanish into weeks. The calendar fills, but the memory doesn't. There's also a psychological effect. When everything moves fast, the mind adapts by raising its threshold for stimulation. What once felt exciting now feels normal. What once felt peaceful now feels boring. So we seek more speed, more novelty, more input. But the faster we go, the less room we leave for stillness. And without stillness, there's no space for meaning to settle in. It's not that life becomes meaningless. It's that meaning needs time, and we've traded time for momentum. This paradox is subtle because it's reinforced by reward. Moving fast can make you feel accomplished. You tick off lists, you meet goals, you stay ahead. But beneath the surface, something starts to fade. Your sense of presence, the ability to be where you are, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. When presence is lost, experience becomes shallow, and over time, the soul begins to ache, not from lack of achievement, but from lack of connection. Escaping the fast life paradox doesn't require abandoning ambition or living in stillness. It requires recognizing that speed isn't always the solution. Sometimes the answer is to slow down, not dramatically, but deliberately, to give one thing your full attention, to let a conversation unfold without rushing to the next point, to eat without distraction, to walk without filling the silence. These acts aren't wasteful. They're reminders of what real life feels like when you're actually in it. Ultimately, the fast life paradox asks us to consider what we're optimizing for. Is it output, or is it experience? Is it efficiency, or is it depth? Are we trying to live more, or just get through more? Life doesn't have to move slowly to be meaningful. But if it moves too fast, we may outrun the very meaning we're searching for. And maybe that's the quiet warning. If you never pause long enough to feel your life, it might keep happening without you. Spotlight effect. We walk into a room and feel like everyone is looking. We say something awkward and assume it's what people will remember. We dress differently, misspeak, trip slightly, and suddenly, it feels like a spotlight has turned on. This is the spotlight effect. The belief that others notice us far more than they actually do. In reality, most people are too absorbed in their own concerns to focus on ours. Yet our minds rarely believe that. The paradox is subtle. We live as if we're being watched, but we're mostly invisible in the ways we fear. This effect is rooted in a simple truth. We are the center of our own consciousness. Every mistake, emotion, or detail feels amplified because we're the ones experiencing it. So we project that intensity outward, imagining others are seeing what we see, feeling what we feel. But they aren't. Everyone else is living inside. Their own spotlight, their own worries, their own narratives. And so, while we think our flaws are exposed, they're usually overlooked. Not out of kindness, but out of distraction. The result is often a quiet kind of suffering. People censor themselves, overthink interactions, and hold back from trying new things. Not because they lack interest or ability, but because they fear being judged. They replay small moments, imagining how others perceived them, rarely realizing those moments barely registered. We assume attention is directed at us, when in truth, it's scattered everywhere and rarely focused for long. This creates a kind of double illusion. On one hand, we feel watched. On the other, we feel alone. We believe people notice everything, yet also believe they don't really understand us. The gap between those two ideas can be confusing. It keeps us self-conscious without making us feel seen. And over time, it builds a cautious way of living. One where we carefully curate our words, our appearance, our behavior, hoping to avoid imagined embarrassment. But ironically, this effort often makes us feel more isolated, not less. The spotlight effect also affects how we remember events. We recall moments when we felt awkward or out of place, assuming others remember them too. But most people have already forgotten. Their attention wasn't fixed on us. It was divided, fleeting, or directed inward. What felt like a defining moment to us was just another passing second for them. And realizing that can be oddly freeing, because it means we're not under as much pressure as we think. There's a gentle lesson hidden here. People aren't thinking about us as much as we fear, and that's not an insult. It's a kind of relief. It gives us space to speak imperfectly, to try things, to fail without permanent consequence. It reminds us that the world isn't holding a spotlight over our every move. Most of the time, the light is turned inward, and everyone is just trying to figure out their own next step. This doesn't mean we don't matter. It means we don't have to perform. It means we can move through the world without assuming we're always being evaluated. We can laugh loudly, say the wrong word, wear what we like, start over and try again. Not because no one will notice, but because most won't care. And those who do notice are usually too wrapped up in their own story to hold on to ours for long. The spotlight effect invites us to live with a little more freedom, to recognize that the fear of being judged is often louder than the judgment itself. And even when people do notice us, their perception is filtered through their own biases, distractions, and insecurities, just like ours. There's no perfect audience out there waiting to critique every step. There's just a world full of people, mostly trying not to trip over their own feet. In the end, we can still care about how we come across. That's natural. But we don't have to be consumed by it. The world isn't a stage with all eyes on us. It's a crowded room where everyone thinks they're under the spotlight. And maybe the real freedom begins when we realize no one's really watching as closely as we imagine. And that gives us permission to just be. Effort paradox. We're taught to admire effort, to work hard, push through, earn what we achieve. It becomes part of how we measure worth, in school, in careers, even in relationships. But then a strange contradiction appears. When something comes easily to someone, a skill, a solution, a creative insight, we often value it less. Not just as observers, but even within ourselves. This is the effort paradox. The idea that the easier something feels, the less credit we give it, even though effort and value aren't always connected. We tend to equate struggle with authenticity and ease with shortcuts. And in doing so, we sometimes overlook true ability. The paradox starts early. A student who studies all night and gets a good grade is praised for their dedication. Another student who breezes through the exam with little preparation is often met with suspicion or even annoyance. Why? Because we subconsciously believe that value lies in how much something costs us. Not just in time or money, but in energy, sacrifice, discomfort. And yet someone who learns quickly, adapts effortlessly, or creates without friction may be demonstrating real mastery. But because it looks easy, we, and sometimes they, downplay it. This dynamic shows up everywhere. In creative fields, people often undervalue their most natural talents. An artist may dismiss their own work because it came out in one sitting. A writer may question the quality of a piece that seemed to just happen. A speaker might apologize for not preparing enough, even when their instinctive delivery is better than a rehearsed one. Effort becomes the expected currency for legitimacy, and when that currency is missing, we feel like we've cheated, even when the result is real. The paradox also applies to how we interpret other people's success. When someone reaches a milestone, our first question is often, how hard did they work for it? If the answer involves long hours, struggle, or sacrifice, we admire them. If it involves luck, timing, or natural ability, we become skeptical. It feels unfair, as if ease undermines legitimacy. But this mindset overlooks an important truth. Value isn't always proportional to pain. Difficulty doesn't guarantee depth, and just because something required effort doesn't mean it produced something meaningful. There's also a psychological cost. People who internalize this paradox may begin to seek difficulty as a way to validate themselves. If something feels too easy, they question its worth. They choose the harder path not because it leads to better results, but because it feels more real. Over time, this can lead to burnout, overcomplication, and a quiet resentment of their own gifts. Instead of following what flows, they force themselves to struggle, because they've learned that only struggle earns respect. But the paradox goes deeper. Because sometimes, real mastery does make things feel easy. After years of practice, the athlete moves effortlessly. The musician finds the notes without thinking. The coder sees the solution before the problem is fully formed. This ease is not the absence of work, it's the result of it. But when we witness that moment, we rarely see the years behind it. We just see someone who makes it look effortless. And in that moment, we might misinterpret ease as luck, when it's actually a quiet kind of excellence. Breaking free from the effort. Paradox doesn't mean rejecting hard work. It means recognizing that ease can be a sign of alignment, not laziness. That sometimes what flows naturally is worth trusting. That the things we're best at may not require us to suffer, and that it's possible for something to be valuable and enjoyable at the same time. We don't need to add struggle to make something real. Sometimes, the absence of struggle is the result of deep skill, clarity, or instinct. And that's not something to hide, it's something to respect. In the end, the effort paradox challenges us to rethink what makes something valuable. It invites us to stop measuring worth by pain and start paying attention to what works, even when it comes easily. Because life isn't always a test of endurance. Sometimes, it's a quiet recognition that effort and value don't always travel together, and that the things we do best might not feel like work at all, which doesn't make them any less real, just easier to overlook. Love paradox. Love is often seen as something precious, something we guard, protect, or offer carefully. But the strange thing about love is that it doesn't behave like a limited resource. The more of it you give, the more it seems to grow. The more tightly you hold on to it, the more it starts to shrink. This is the love paradox. Love expands through expression, through generosity, through vulnerability. Yet when we try to preserve it, control it, or keep it safe, we risk suffocating it. Unlike material things, love isn't depleted by sharing, it's strengthened. And yet, fear makes us act as if love is fragile, as if giving too much means we'll be left with too little. That fear can turn love inward, into self-protection, calculation, or withholding. And in doing so, it slowly erodes the very connection we were trying to preserve. The paradox shows itself in subtle ways. In relationships, we sometimes withhold affection until we feel secure. We wait for the other person to prove themselves. We hesitate to express how much we care because we're afraid of seeming too invested, too vulnerable. But love isn't a negotiation. It's a choice to give without guarantees. When it becomes transactional, I'll show love if you do first, it loses its strength. Because love isn't about leverage, it's about freedom. It can't thrive in a space of fear or control. The more we try to measure or ration it, the less alive it becomes. This doesn't mean love should be blind or boundaryless, but the paradox asks us to consider the cost of self-protection. When we hold back, we think we're keeping ourselves safe, but often, we're also keeping ourselves disconnected. We want to feel closeness, but we fear the exposure that closeness requires. We want intimacy, but without the risk. And so we wait, for proof, for safety, for the perfect moment. And while we wait, love starts to fade, not because it was never there, but because it was never allowed to fully exist. The paradox also becomes clear in how we interpret strength. Some people believe love makes them vulnerable, soft, exposed, so they pull away, remain guarded, or express affection through distance, believing that independence is safer than emotional openness. But love is not weakness. Love, when expressed fully, requires courage. To say, "I care about you," without knowing if it will be returned, is a brave act. And in giving love freely, we're not making ourselves smaller. We're choosing to live in a way that prioritizes connection over control. Love, like trust, requires a leap. You cannot build it while holding onto the edge. It only begins when you step off. That leap is what gives it meaning, and also what makes it terrifying. But the paradox is that the risk is also the reward. When you give love, real love, it often invites the same in return, not because you demanded it, but because the space you created made it possible. And even if it isn't returned, the act of giving doesn't make you less. It affirms something about who you are, not just who the other person is. Another layer of the paradox is that love cannot be forced, and yet it also cannot be hidden. When we feel it, it shapes our words, our presence, our actions. Trying to suppress it often makes it stronger, not weaker, but trying to control it, to dictate its terms, its outcomes, its timing, drains it of its authenticity. Love grows best in freedom, and freedom requires letting go of certainty. This doesn't mean giving everything away without care, but it does mean accepting that love is an act of faith, not in the other person, but in love itself. Ultimately, the love paradox asks us to shift how we think about giving. Love isn't lost when it's offered. It's lost when it's withheld. The more we try to keep it safe, the less of it we feel. But when we share it, when we let it move freely, even without guarantees, it multiplies. Not always in others, but within ourselves. We become more open, more human, more alive. And in that openness, real connection becomes possible, not because we've protected ourselves, but because we've allowed ourselves to be seen. Time paradox. Time is the one thing we all share, yet no one seems to have enough of it. We organize our lives around it, measure our worth by it, and often feel like we're racing against it. But the more aware we become of time, how much we've used, how much we have left, how quickly it passes, the harder it becomes to live inside of it. This is the time paradox. The more we focus on time, the more we lose our experience of it. We try to save time, manage time, control time. Yet the more we try to master it, the more time begins to feel like something that's slipping through our fingers. The very thing we're trying to use wisely becomes a source of anxiety. We often think of time as a resource, something we can waste, invest, or spend. But treating time like a currency creates a subtle kind of pressure. Every second must count. Every hour must be optimized. Even leisure becomes a performance. A relaxing evening isn't just for rest. It's recovery for tomorrow's productivity. And so time, rather than feeling like the space in which life happens, begins to feel like a constant evaluation. Are you behind? Are you using it well? Is it slipping away? These questions become louder the more we pay attention to the clock. The paradox grows sharper when we realize how uneven time feels. A minute in silence can feel longer than an hour in motion. A joyful day can vanish in a flash, while a painful one drags endlessly. Time stretches and compresses, not objectively, but emotionally. And yet, we treat it as fixed. We schedule, we plan, we track, assuming that time is a stable structure we can move through in straight lines. But our experience of time rarely follows the calendar. It's colored by attention, emotion, memory. And the more we try to control it, the more disconnected we often feel from the moment we're in. There's also a psychological cost to time consciousness. Constant awareness of time makes presence harder. You sit with someone, but you're watching the clock. You start a creative task, but you're calculating how long it will take. Even during rest, your mind is already on what comes next. It's hard to be where you are when you're always measuring where you should be. And so life becomes fragmented. Each moment only a means to get to the next. You're always moving, but never quite arriving. Ironically, some of the most meaningful moments in life happen when time disappears. When you're so absorbed in something, a conversation, a piece of music, a task, that you lose track of hours. In those rare spaces, you're not fighting time, chasing it, or fearing it. You're simply in it. These are the moments we later describe as timeless, but trying to capture them deliberately often backfires. As soon as you try to make something timeless, you're pulled back into the mindset of measurement. The paradox appears again. You can't plan for presence, only allow it. Culturally, we're conditioned to value productivity over presence. Time used well is often defined by output, but time felt deeply, time that lingers in memory, that shapes identity, rarely fits inside a schedule. It happens in pauses, in in-between moments, in the space where nothing urgent is demanding our attention. The paradox is that those are the very moments we tend to overlook. We chase what's measurable and miss what's meaningful. The time paradox doesn't ask us to ignore time. It asks us to relate to it differently, to see time not only as something that passes, but as something we participate in, to let go of the illusion that we can always manage it, and to recognize that some of life's best experiences happen not in control, but in surrender. When we stop fighting time, stop trying to outrun it, outwork it, outsmart it, we may finally begin to feel it again. In the end, time moves forward no matter what we do. But how we experience it is not fixed. We can keep measuring every second, or we can begin noticing them. And maybe the point isn't to use every moment perfectly, but to be present for enough of them that life doesn't just pass by, but actually touches us while it's here. Paradox of control. Control is comforting. It gives us a sense of order, predictability, and safety in a world that often feels uncertain. We try to control our schedules, our environments, our emotions, and sometimes even other people. But over time, something unsettling starts to happen. The more tightly we try to manage everything, the more brittle life begins to feel. This is the paradox of control. The more we seek control, the less in control we often feel. Attempts to dominate uncertainty can backfire, creating rigidity, anxiety, and frustration instead of peace. The very effort to force stability begins to produce instability. The need for control becomes a source of stress, and the fear of losing control starts to define our lives more than anything we're actually trying to manage. It starts subtly. You plan a day carefully, and something unexpected happens. A delay, a comment, a shift in mood. And even if the disruption is small, it feels disproportionately uncomfortable. Not because the event itself is terrible, but because it violated your imagined control. The more precise your expectations, the more fragile your peace becomes. Flexibility fades. There's less room for surprise, for spontaneity, for error. And so, life begins to feel like a set of systems to be maintained, rather than moments to be lived. When control becomes the priority, presence becomes the casualty. This paradox becomes especially clear in our relationships. Trying to control how others feel, respond, or behave may offer short-term results, but it usually erodes connection. The more you try to manage someone's reactions, the less authentic their responses become. Trust starts to fade, conversations become cautious, and instead of feeling close, you feel distanced, not because you cared too little, but because you tried to control too much. The same applies internally. Trying to control your own emotions, to suppress anger, sadness, fear, doesn't remove them. It often intensifies them. What you resist doesn't disappear. It waits, builds, and eventually leaks out in other ways. Control also creates an illusion that we can eliminate risk, avoid discomfort, or perfect outcomes if we just try hard enough. But life rarely works like that. The need for absolute control often masks deeper fears of failure, of rejection, of uncertainty itself. And when we don't get the outcome we work so hard to secure, it feels personal, as if we failed not just in result, but in character. This turns every setback into a threat to our identity. The desire for control, rather than being empowering, becomes exhausting. There's a freedom that comes from letting go, not of responsibility, but of overmanagement, of allowing space for things not to go as planned, of making room for mistakes, for silence, for things you can't predict or force. This isn't the same as giving up. It's choosing to engage with life on its own terms, not as a system to be dominated. It means replacing rigidity with resilience. You still care. You still act. But you're not ruled by the illusion that everything must go according to plan in order for you to be okay. Ironically, people who learn to release control often gain a deeper kind of strength. They're less shaken by setbacks. They're more adaptable when plans change. And their relationships tend to feel safer, because people can sense when they're being controlled and when they're being accepted. Letting go doesn't mean chaos. It means recognizing where control ends and trust begins. Trust in others, trust in yourself, and sometimes trust in the unknown. Ultimately, the paradox of control invites us to shift our focus from controlling everything to choosing how we respond to what we can't control. It asks us to stop treating uncertainty as a failure and start seeing it as part of being alive. Because the truth is, life was never meant to be fully controlled. It was meant to be experienced, shaped, and sometimes surrendered to. And maybe real control doesn't come from holding on tighter, but from learning when and how to let go. Paradox of memory. Memory is how we understand who we are. It tells us where we've been, what we've felt, what we've learned. It forms the story we carry, the quiet thread that connects one moment to the next. But memory is not a perfect recording. It's selective, fragmented, and often reshaped by emotion, time, and hindsight. This is the paradox of memory. We depend on memory to make sense of our lives, yet the very thing we depend on is constantly being rewritten. We trust it to guide us, but it's not stable. We look to it for truth, even though it quietly bends, in reality, to fit our narrative. And yet, without memory, we would have no continuity, no identity, no self. We are shaped by something that is both essential and unreliable. The paradox begins with how memory functions. It doesn't store facts like a hard drive. Instead, it reconstructs the past every time we recall it. Each memory is filtered through our current emotions, beliefs, and context. So when we remember something, we're not retrieving it. We're re-experiencing a version of it. That version may feel accurate, but it's already changed. And the more we revisit it, the more it shifts. Details are lost, added, or emphasized differently. Yet we continue to base important decisions, judgments, and feelings on these reconstructions. The past, as we remember it, is never quite what it was, but it still defines us. This paradox shows up in both subtle and profound ways. A moment from childhood may feel crystal clear, until someone else who was there remembers it completely differently. A relationship may feel like it ended in betrayal, but over time that memory softens or sharpens or reverses. Even traumatic events, when replayed often enough, can begin to blur into something less precise, but more emotionally charged. And yet, we rarely question the accuracy of what we remember. We assume our memory is solid, that our version of the story is the real one, but it rarely is. This unreliability wouldn't matter so much if memory were just about the past. But memory is also how we imagine the future. The brain uses memory to project, to simulate what might happen next, based on what happened before. And so, a distorted memory doesn't just affect how we see what's behind us. It shapes what we expect moving forward. If we remember failure more vividly than success, we become hesitant. If we remember being hurt, we become guarded. If we remember ourselves as helpless, we act accordingly, even if that memory was incomplete or untrue. In this way, memory doesn't just reflect who we were, it creates who we become. The paradox deepens when we realize how attached we are to our memories. They aren't just stories, they're anchors. They give us continuity in a constantly changing world. But that continuity is sometimes artificial. We fill in gaps. We smooth over contradictions. We highlight the pieces that make us feel consistent, even if the reality was more complex. And in doing so, we reinforce an identity that may feel true, but is actually a curated version of ourselves. We forget how much of our story was shaped not by what happened, but by how we chose, consciously or not, to remember it. This doesn't mean memory is useless. It means we need to treat it with humility, to recognize that our memories are not facts, but impressions, that our past is not a fixed landscape, but a shifting reflection in the mind. This awareness doesn't weaken our story. It makes it more human. It allows us to hold space for doubt, to be open to other perspectives, to question the beliefs we've carried for years simply because they were attached to something we remembered. Ultimately, the paradox of memory asks us to live with both reverence and skepticism, to respect memory as the tool that connects us to meaning, but not to mistake it for unchanging truth. Because the mind doesn't preserve the past, it retells it, and in that retelling, it subtly changes the path we're on. We are not just living with memories, we are living through them. And maybe the most honest thing we can do is to keep asking gently, is this how it really happened? Or is this just the version I've come to believe? Forgiveness, paradox, forgiveness is often seen as a noble act, something we offer to those who have hurt us once they've shown remorse or made things right. But when the time comes to actually forgive, it rarely feels noble. It feels complicated, unfair, even disorienting. You've been wronged, you didn't deserve it, and yet now somehow you're being asked to let go. This is the forgiveness paradox. The very act that is meant to bring healing can feel, in the moment, like surrender. Forgiveness is supposed to offer peace, but to get there, you must give up something first. The story that says you are owed. And that's where the paradox lies. You want closure, but forgiveness can feel like erasing the past. You want freedom, but forgiveness requires loosening your grip on the anger that helped you survive. This paradox deepens when we realize that holding on to pain, blame, or resentment can serve a purpose. It gives the hurt a shape. It makes sense of what happened. It protects us from feeling foolish or vulnerable. Anger, in particular, is active. It gives us energy, focus, direction. It can make us feel powerful, even when we're wounded. So the idea of releasing that, of softening, of letting someone off the hook, can feel like betrayal. Not betrayal of them, but betrayal of ourselves. As if to forgive means to say, it wasn't that bad, or worse, I'm okay with what you did. But that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean excusing. It means deciding not to carry the weight any longer, not for them, but for you. This is where the paradox reveals its twist. Holding on to resentment punishes the person who was hurt more than the person who caused the harm. The memory stays active. The emotion lingers. The wound is reopened over and over again. And so, even when the offender is long gone, out of your life, unaware or indifferent, they still occupy space in your mind. Forgiveness, then, becomes less about them and more about reclaiming that space. But this realization doesn't make forgiveness easy. It just reframes the reason. You're not forgiving because they deserve it. You're forgiving because you deserve peace. Still, many hesitate. They want accountability. They want justice. They want an apology that feels real. And when that doesn't come, forgiveness feels premature, like a gift that hasn't been earned. But the paradox is that waiting for the other person to make things right can become its own prison. You tie your emotional release to their behavior, and if they never meet your expectations, you stay stuck. Forgiveness, paradoxically, requires an act of independence. It's not waiting, it's deciding. You no longer need their words, their guilt, or their regret to move forward. You choose to release them, and yourself, from the loop. Another layer of the paradox is how misunderstood forgiveness can be. People fear that if they forgive too easily, they'll be taken advantage of, or that they're signaling weakness. But forgiveness isn't passivity. It's not an invitation to repeat the harm. You can forgive someone and still set boundaries. You can forgive and still walk away. Forgiveness isn't about allowing, it's about releasing. You're no longer spending energy rehearsing the pain. You're not trying to rewrite what happened. You're choosing to live beyond it. The paradox also touches something deeper. Our relationship with identity. Sometimes the pain becomes part of who we are. It defines us. It explains our reactions, our fears, our sense of justice. To forgive, then, can feel like giving up a piece of that identity. Who are you without the story of what they did? What replaces the anger, the sharpness, the vigilance? There's a strange comfort in resentment. It gives shape to the hurt. Letting go of that structure can feel like walking into emptiness. But it's in that emptiness that something new can grow, something lighter, quieter, more peaceful. In the end, the forgiveness paradox reminds us that the path to peace is rarely straightforward. Forgiveness feels like it should come after healing, but often it's the act that begins it. And though forgiveness may feel, at first, like you're giving something up, what you often get in return is far greater. Clarity, freedom, space, not because the past didn't matter, but because it doesn't have to own the future. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It reclaims who you are beyond what happened. Toxic positivity, paradox. Positivity is usually seen as a virtue, something to strive for, something to cultivate. We're told to look on the bright side, stay grateful, keep smiling, and often that mindset helps. But sometimes, when positivity is used to cover up real emotions, sadness, anger, fear, grief, it stops being helpful. It becomes pressure. This is the toxic positivity paradox. The more we insist on feeling good, the less space we leave to feel real. In trying to reject negativity, we end up suppressing what makes us human. And instead of lifting ourselves or others up, we create a subtle environment where only certain emotions are allowed, and everything else is pushed aside. This paradox becomes especially visible during hard times. Someone loses a job, ends, a relationship, gets sick, and the first thing they hear is, stay strong. Everything happens for a reason. Just focus on the positives. These words are usually well-intentioned, meant to comfort or redirect, but what they often communicate is this: your pain makes me uncomfortable. Please move past it quickly. The message behind constant positivity is rarely malicious, but it is limiting. It tells people that certain emotions are unacceptable, that expressing fear or sadness is a kind of failure. And so, people begin to hide. They pretend to be okay when they're not. They smile when they feel like crying. They become emotionally isolated while appearing socially adjusted. This doesn't just affect how we treat others. It changes how we treat ourselves. When we internalize the idea that we should always feel good, we start judging our own reactions. Feeling anxious becomes a problem to fix. Feeling low becomes something to hide. But emotions don't disappear just because we ignore them. They get buried. And buried emotions don't heal. They fester. Over time, they surface in other ways: fatigue, tension, apathy, irritability. The effort to be constantly positive ends up generating the very discomfort it was trying to avoid. The paradox deepens when we realize how positivity can be used to avoid vulnerability. True emotional openness requires honesty, not just about joy and gratitude, but about uncertainty, fear, and disappointment. When someone says, "I'm fine," with a forced smile, they might be protecting themselves from judgment. But they're also cutting themselves off from support, and the people around them, seeing that smile, assume everything's okay, when it isn't. A culture of toxic positivity creates an illusion of well-being. Everyone seems okay, but no one feels truly seen. This mindset is often reinforced by media and social norms. We scroll through curated highlights, motivational quotes, and upbeat affirmations, and we begin to believe that happiness is a constant state we should be able to maintain. If we're not smiling, something must be wrong. But that belief is exhausting. It turns everyday emotional fluctuations into crises. It teaches us to ignore complexity. And life, at its core, is complex. It includes joy and sorrow, hope and fear, gain and loss. Pretending otherwise doesn't make us healthier. It makes us disconnected. The paradox also shows up in personal growth. The idea that positive thinking attracts positive outcomes can be empowering, but it can also become oppressive. It suggests that if something goes wrong, it's because you weren't thinking positively enough. Pain becomes a personal failure. Struggle becomes a mindset issue. But this view ignores context, circumstances, and the messy realities of being human. It replaces compassion with blame, even if that blame is dressed in encouraging language. Breaking. The cycle doesn't mean rejecting positivity altogether. It means making room for the full range of experience. Real emotional health isn't about being positive all the time. It's about being real all the time, about allowing joy when it's present and sorrow when it's needed, about offering support that says it's okay to not be okay and meaning it. It means showing up for ourselves and others not with answers, but with presence. Ultimately, the toxic positivity paradox reminds us that emotions don't need fixing. They need witnessing. That healing doesn't come from skipping over pain, but from moving through it. And that authenticity, not constant happiness, is what makes us feel alive, connected, and whole. Positivity can be beautiful when it's honest, not as a mask, but as a light that comes after sitting in the dark without rushing to escape it. Attachment paradox. Attachment is one of the most natural parts of being human. We form bonds to people, places, routines, ideas. These attachments bring comfort, meaning, and stability. They give life texture and shape. But over time, a contradiction begins to surface. The more deeply we cling to something, the more vulnerable we become to its loss. The more we rely on it, the more fragile our peace becomes. This is the attachment paradox. The very things that bring us joy and security can also be the source of our deepest suffering. And yet, without attachment, life can feel empty. We can't love without risk. We can't connect without investing. So we live in this tension, holding on while knowing we may have to let go. The paradox becomes clear in relationships. Loving someone often means attaching your well-being to theirs, their presence, their mood, their availability. But people change. They leave. They struggle. They drift. And when our sense of self becomes entangled with them, even small changes can feel destabilizing. What once felt like connection can turn into dependence. And what once brought joy can start to generate fear of loss, rejection, or abandonment. But the solution isn't detachment, at least not in the cold, distant sense. It's awareness. The recognition that attachment, if left unchecked, can become possession. And that love without room to breathe begins to collapse under its own weight. This paradox also appears in how we relate to identity. We attach ourselves to roles, student, partner, parent, leader, and over time, those roles begin to define us. But when circumstances change and those roles shift or disappear, we may feel lost. Not because life has ended, but because the attachment was so strong, we forgot who we were without it. Even our beliefs, political, religious, philosophical, can become attachments. We hold them tightly, sometimes so tightly that any challenge feels like a personal threat. The more something becomes part of who we are, the harder it becomes to see it clearly. And yet, without some form of attachment, we struggle to feel grounded. We need something to hold on to, even if we know we may have to release it one day. What makes this paradox so difficult is that the alternative, complete detachment, often leads to disconnection. A person who avoids attachment to avoid pain may also avoid depth. They keep relationships shallow, ambitions limited, emotions guarded. They might be safe, but they're also alone. Life without attachment may feel peaceful, but it often lacks color. The challenge is not to avoid attachment, but to relate to it differently. To love fully while knowing that nothing lasts forever. To commit without clinging, to care without control. The paradox is not meant to be solved, but balanced. It invites us to explore a middle space, one where we embrace what we love without needing it to remain the same, where we can grieve, change without fearing it, where we can hold what matters with open hands, not clenched fists. This doesn't come naturally. Most of us want certainty, stability, guarantees. But the deeper truth is that life is constantly moving. People evolve, circumstances shift, and our ability to stay emotionally agile, to care deeply without collapsing when things change, may be one of the most important skills we ever develop. Ultimately, the attachment paradox reminds us that to love is to risk. There's no way around it, but the risk isn't a flaw, it's the cost of connection. The goal isn't to stop forming attachments, but to stop letting them control us. To love someone or something so fully that we can let it grow, even if that means growing away from us. That kind of love is rare. It's not easy, but it's free from the fear that ruins so many of our most meaningful experiences. Because when we stop clinging, we start seeing the beauty of what is, not just the fear of what might be lost. Presence paradox. Presence is often talked about as something simple, just being here, in the moment, with the people around us. But in reality, presence is far more elusive. You can sit across from someone, hear every word they say, even respond, and still not truly be there. You can walk through your own life while thinking about yesterday or worrying about tomorrow. You can be physically available, but emotionally distant. This is the presence paradox. Being present in body doesn't mean being present in mind, and the harder we try to hold on to the moment, the more easily it slips away. We chase presence as if it's a task, something to achieve. But presence isn't something you do, it's something you notice. And noticing requires attention, which is constantly pulled elsewhere. This paradox plays out in quiet, ordinary ways. You're having a conversation, and your eyes are on the person in front of you, but your mind is elsewhere, on a deadline, a text message, a memory, or you're at home, surrounded by people you love, and yet you feel strangely alone, because your thoughts are somewhere in the future. You don't mean to drift, it just happens. And when it does, you miss the moment entirely, not because it wasn't meaningful, but because your attention was never fully in it. Over time, this absence becomes a habit. We move through our lives always slightly removed from them, watching, evaluating, calculating, but rarely experiencing. The paradox deepens with technology. In a world where we're always connected, we're rarely undistracted. Notifications, schedules, endless content, each one gently pulling us away from the moment we're in. Even when we're not actively distracted, we're anticipating the next thing. Presence becomes fragmented, attention becomes divided, and slowly, we start to associate physical nearness with emotional connection, even when they're not aligned. We convince ourselves that proximity is enough, that showing up means being present. But presence is more than location. It's intention. It's the willingness to set everything else down, even for a few seconds, and be with what's actually happening. This paradox also appears internally. We try to be mindful, to stay grounded in the now, but we approach it like a performance. We sit quietly, but think about whether we're doing it right. We go for a walk, but track our steps and pace. We try to slow down, but evaluate the effectiveness of our slowness. The attempt to be present turns into another task to manage, and the moment becomes something to optimize rather than something to experience. The paradox is that presence cannot be forced. The more you try to hold it still, the more it moves. Presence arises not from effort, but from allowing, from noticing what's already there, not what we think should be. The presence paradox also shapes our relationships. Being with someone is not the same as being with them. True presence in a relationship means listening without preparing a reply, sitting in silence without needing to fill it, making eye contact without checking a screen. These small acts create a space where real connection can happen. But when presence is missing, even if you're physically together and that space closes, the person next to you starts to feel distant. not because they've gone anywhere, but because you have. Escaping the present's paradox doesn't mean abandoning responsibilities or retreating into stillness. It means learning to return, to catch yourself drifting and gently come back, to notice when your body is here but your mind isn't, and to close the gap, not perfectly, but intentionally. It means choosing, again and again, to show up for the life you're already in, even when your thoughts are busy pulling you elsewhere. Ultimately, the present's paradox reminds us that life isn't lived in general. It's lived in moments. And if we're always slightly ahead of ourselves, slightly behind, slightly removed, then the richness of those moments slips by unnoticed. We don't need more time. We need to feel the time we already have. Not in dramatic, life-changing bursts, but in small pauses, in ordinary spaces, in everyday moments that become extraordinary simply because we were there for them. Paradox of becoming. Self-improvement is often framed as a journey, a path from who we are to who we could be. We set goals, build habits, seek growth, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Change can be meaningful. Progress can be fulfilling, but over time, something subtle starts to happen. The more we fixate on becoming something better, the more we begin to feel like we're not enough now. This is the paradox of becoming. In trying to improve ourselves, we quietly create a sense of inadequacy in the present. We start to believe that happiness, peace, or self-worth live in some future version of us, and that until we arrive there, we're unfinished. This mindset is easy to slip into. We create ideal images of the person we want to become, more confident, more disciplined, more successful, and then compare ourselves to that imagined version. But because that version keeps evolving, the gap never closes. Even when we make progress, we often move the target. What was once a goal becomes a new baseline, and the cycle begins again. The problem isn't that we want to grow, it's that we mistake growth for validation. We stop asking, what do I want to explore? And start asking, what do I need to fix about myself before I can be enough? The paradox becomes especially clear when we realize how much of our self-talk is future-focused. When I get in shape, when I land that job, when I finally feel confident, these phrases imply that who we are now is temporary, a placeholder, and while there's value in wanting more, constantly living in the future makes it hard to inhabit the present. We become someone in pursuit, never someone at rest. The image of our future self becomes a shadow, always ahead, always better, quietly making us feel like we haven't arrived. This mindset also reshapes how we interpret discomfort. Instead of seeing insecurity, fear, or struggle as part of being human, we treat them as signs that we haven't yet become who we're supposed to be. Growth becomes a condition for acceptance. We delay kindness to ourselves, waiting until we've earned it. We view imperfection not as natural, but as something that disqualifies us from contentment. And so we push harder, not just to grow, but to escape the feeling of being less than. But this approach has a cost. It can make self-improvement a form of self-rejection. It turns inner work into a constant reminder that we're not there yet. It replaces curiosity with pressure, exploration with judgment, and over time, it can erode the very motivation we started with. When the pursuit of becoming is fueled by a belief that we're not enough now, it becomes exhausting, because no matter how far we go, we're still chasing ourselves. There's a different way to grow, one that doesn't require abandoning the present self. It begins with the idea that change doesn't have to come from deficiency. You can want to evolve without believing that your current self is broken. You can hold space for both gratitude and aspiration. You can work toward a goal while respecting where you are right now. The key is shifting from growth as proof to growth as expression, not becoming someone better, but becoming more fully yourself. This doesn't mean giving up on goals. It means loosening the belief that happiness exists only on the other side of achievement. That peace only comes after transformation. The truth is, we never stop becoming. There's no final version of you waiting to be unlocked. There's only the version you're living now, capable of growth, yes, but also worthy of care. When you recognize that, growth stops being a race. It becomes a process you walk through with your eyes open, not your teeth clenched. Ultimately, the paradox of becoming invites us to balance movement with presence. To grow not because we dislike who we are, but because we're curious about who we can become. And maybe the real arrival isn't some future version of you. It's the moment you stop waiting to be someone else before allowing yourself to feel whole. Communication paradox. Communication is often described as the foundation of connection. We talk to express ourselves, to solve problems, to build relationships. We assume that more communication means more understanding, that if we just explain clearly enough or say the right words, we'll be heard. But over time, a quiet contradiction starts to appear. The more we talk, the more chances we create to be misunderstood. The more we try to clarify, the more complicated things can become. And sometimes, saying nothing at all carries more truth than any attempt to explain. This is the communication paradox. The very thing meant to bring us closer can also push us apart, and in trying to be fully understood, we can end up feeling even more isolated. This paradox often shows up in emotionally charged moments. You try to explain how you feel, and the more you talk, the more the other person seems to retreat. You find yourself repeating the same point, rephrasing, raising your voice, not out of anger, but out of desperation to be seen. But instead of creating clarity, your words start to blur together. The message gets lost, not because it wasn't sincere, but because it was too much, too fast, or too layered to land. At some point, you realize the person stopped listening, not out of disrespect, but because they reached their limit. And in that moment, more communication doesn't help. It only deepens the gap. The paradox also appears when words are used to protect rather than connect. We sometimes talk to avoid silence, to fill space, to keep things light when they feel heavy. But when communication becomes a shield, it loses its honesty. We might say what sounds good instead of what feels true. We might talk around the issue rather than into it. We might use humor, logic, or distraction, anything to avoid vulnerability. And yet it's that very vulnerability that builds real connection. So while we're technically communicating, we're not actually being known. The signal is active, but the message never arrives. Technology adds another layer. We're more connected than ever, always reachable, always available. But this constant connection can make communication feel shallow. Messages are read but not felt. Responses are fast but thin. Misunderstandings multiply because tone is hard to read, context is missing, and attention is divided. We talk more than we ever have, yet many people feel lonelier than ever. The channels are open, but the substance is lost. We're speaking, but we're not really being heard. And sometimes, paradoxically, it's silence that communicates the most. A pause can say what words can't. The absence of a response can carry more weight than a dozen explanations. Silence can be respect, or resistance, or reflection. It can be an invitation to slow down and listen. But it can also be misread. Just like words, silence is open to interpretation. And that makes it powerful, but also fragile. In the absence of clarity, people fill in the gaps themselves, often based on fear or assumption. So silence can connect, but it can also confuse. Again, communication, even in its absence, is full of contradiction. The paradox also becomes personal. You may reach a point where you no longer want to explain yourself. Not because you don't care, but because you're tired. You've tried to communicate your needs, your boundaries, your feelings, and somewhere along the way, you stopped feeling heard. So you go quiet, not to punish, but to protect. And in that quiet, people may finally start to notice something is wrong. But now the roles have reversed. They want to talk, and you no longer do. The moment for connection passed somewhere in the noise. Ultimately, the communication paradox invites us to see that connection isn't just about speaking. It's about being received And being received requires more than the right words. It requires timing, trust, presence, and a willingness to listen. Real communication is a shared space, not a performance. It's less about filling silence and more about creating understanding. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can say is nothing, just offering presence, attention, and the space for something real to emerge. Growth paradox. Growth is something we all say we want. We seek it in our careers, relationships, habits, mindset. We read books, attend seminars, set goals, all in pursuit of becoming a better version of ourselves. But the experience of growth rarely matches the image we have of it. It doesn't feel clear or satisfying or strong. It often feels messy, frustrating, lonely. This is the growth paradox. The moments when you are growing the most rarely feel like growth at all. In fact, they often feel like being lost, like breaking down, like taking a step backward. And yet, it's in those exact moments, the ones we try to rush through or escape, that something important is shifting beneath the surface. This paradox appears most clearly during transitions. A job ends, a relationship changes, a plan doesn't work out, and suddenly, the path forward is unclear. You doubt your direction, your ability, your identity. And yet, this discomfort is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that you're being stretched beyond your current limits. Growth rarely happens when things are stable. It happens when things are shaken. Not because instability is good, but because it forces you to let go of what's familiar. And it's in that letting go of old roles, old patterns, old expectations, that something new can begin to take root. But the paradox makes it hard to recognize progress while it's happening. We assume growth should feel like momentum, but often it feels like standing still. We assume it should come with confidence, but often it comes with doubt. We picture growth as a straight line, each day a little better than the one before. But real growth is full of setbacks, plateaus, and sudden drops. The narrative of improvement rarely matches the lived experience. And because of that mismatch, we sometimes give up just before things start to change. Not because we weren't capable, but because we didn't realize that confusion was part of the process. This paradox also shows up in personal healing. You may think you're going backward because old emotions resurface. But revisiting pain doesn't mean you've regressed. It often means you're finally strong enough to face it. You may feel weaker because you're crying more, or more anxious because you're paying attention to things you used to avoid. But that attention is not weakness, it's awareness. It's a shift from survival mode to conscious reflection, and even though it feels uncomfortable, it's often the first real sign of growth. The growth paradox is difficult to accept because we want visible proof, something measurable, something others can see. But some of the most important growth is invisible. It happens quietly, in thoughts you no longer believe, in reactions you no longer have, in boundaries you now set. It's easy to miss because it doesn't come with applause or milestones. It just becomes part of who you are. And by the time you realize you've grown, the hardest part is already behind you. The paradox also challenges how we view struggle. We often try to eliminate discomfort as quickly as possible. But if we move too fast, rushing to fix, numb, or avoid, we risk missing what that discomfort is trying to show us. Growth isn't found in constantly pushing forward. Sometimes it's found in staying still long enough to let something fall apart and trusting that it's okay if you don't have the answers yet. Progress is not always movement. Sometimes it's transformation without motion. Ultimately, the growth paradox reminds us that becoming is rarely comfortable. The very moments that feel like falling apart are often the ones where we're finally shedding what no longer fits. And while growth may not feel good in real time, that doesn't mean it's not happening. The absence of clarity is not the absence of change. And maybe the most honest thing you can do is to keep going, not because you're sure, but because you trust that the process will make sense in hindsight, even if it doesn't now. Nostalgia paradox. Nostalgia often arrives quietly. A familiar song plays, an old photo resurfaces, a place you once knew reappears in passing. And suddenly, you're not quite in the present anymore. You're remembering a version of life that felt simpler, softer, more certain. It doesn't matter if it was actually better. What matters is how it felt. That feeling, warm, comforting, bittersweet, is what makes nostalgia so powerful. But there's a contradiction buried inside it. The more we long for the past, the harder it becomes to fully inhabit the present. This is the nostalgia paradox. While looking back can bring comfort, it can also make the current moment feel inadequate by comparison. The very thing that soothes us can also quietly steal our attention from the life we're still living. Nostalgia doesn't just bring back memories, it reshapes them. It softens edges, smooths over complexity, turns ordinary moments into emotional landmarks. A difficult time becomes bearable in hindsight. A routine becomes sacred. We don't remember the stress, the boredom, the noise. We remember the way the light looked through the window, or how someone's voice sounded when they laughed. And that selective memory is not wrong, but it's incomplete. The past is easier to love because it's done. It can't change. It can't disappoint us anymore. But the present, it's still unfolding, still uncertain, still vulnerable to loss. So nostalgia offers something the present can't: safety. But it's a safety that exists only in memory. This paradox becomes more visible during transitions. Leaving home, growing older, changing jobs, watching children grow. Each moment of forward movement activates a pull in the opposite direction. We miss what we didn't realize we were saying goodbye to. We revisit old times not just to remember, but to reconnect with a version of ourselves we fear we're losing. And in doing so, we sometimes begin to devalue what's here now. The present starts to feel like something we're just passing through, not something worth investing in. And yet, if we're not careful, we end up turning the present into tomorrow's regret, something we didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. The nostalgia paradox also shapes how we view change. We often resist the new not because it's worse, but because it's unfamiliar. We hold on to old songs, old routines, old technology, not always out of preference, but out of emotional attachment. The new demands effort. It doesn't yet carry the emotional weight of memory, so we romanticize the old, not because it was perfect, but because it's easier to love something when it no longer demands anything from us. It becomes a fixed point in a life that keeps moving, and we return to it as a form of emotional grounding. But grounding can become anchoring, and anchoring can become avoidance. This doesn't mean nostalgia is harmful. In fact, it can be healing. Revisiting the past can remind us of what matters. It can reconnect us to joy, meaning, or identity. But it becomes a problem when we confuse memory with measurement, when we judge the present against an idealized past and find it lacking. The past didn't feel perfect while we were living it. It felt uncertain, just like now. But we forget that. We hold today up against a version of yesterday that never fully existed. And when we do that, we risk missing what's right in front of us, moments that, in time, could become just as meaningful. The paradox isn't asking us to let go of the past. It's asking us not to live inside it, to see nostalgia as a window, not a home, to use it as a reminder of what's possible, not as a reason to disengage, because the present, even with its uncertainty, is the only place life actually happens. It's where new memories are made, when new relationships grow, when new meaning takes shape. And if we're always looking backward, we never give the present a chance to become something worth remembering. Ultimately, the nostalgia paradox invites us to love the past without trying to return to it, to honor it without being trapped by it, and to realize that one day, this moment, as imperfect and incomplete as it feels, may be the very thing we long for. The question is whether we'll be present enough to notice it while it's still here. Knowledge paradox. Knowledge is often treated like a ladder, something we climb one step at a time toward greater clarity, understanding, and control. We read, study, observe, ask questions. The more we learn, the smarter we become. And in many ways, that's true. Knowledge sharpens our thinking, expands our perspective, and gives us tools to navigate the world. But there's a quiet contradiction that emerges the deeper we go. The more we learn, the more we become aware of what we don't know. This is the knowledge paradox. Education increases not just what we understand, but also our awareness of the limits of our understanding. With every answer, a new set of questions appears. With every insight, a larger mystery reveals itself. Knowledge doesn't simplify the world. It often makes it more complex. This paradox is often felt during deep study. At first, a subject seems simple. A few definitions, a few rules, a clear structure. But the more time you spend with it, the more nuance you uncover. What once seemed clear becomes layered. You realize that experts in the field disagree, that concepts have exceptions, that terms you thought you understood actually require a lifetime to master. And so, while your knowledge is increasing, your confidence might be decreasing. Not because you know less, but because you've stepped outside the illusion of certainty. This effect is sometimes described through the Dunning-Kruger curve. People with limited knowledge tend to overestimate their understanding, while those with deeper knowledge become more cautious, not because they're unsure of their skills, but because they're more aware of what lies beyond them. The paradox is that genuine expertise often includes the humility to say, "I don't know," or "It depends." That's not a weakness. It's a sign of wisdom. But in a culture that rewards certainty, quick answers, and simplified truths, that humility can be misread as indecision or doubt. The knowledge paradox also affects how we relate to others. When we learn something new, it's tempting to believe we've figured something out that others haven't. But if we stop there, we risk turning knowledge into a wall rather than a bridge. Real understanding doesn't create superiority. It creates curiosity. It invites us to keep listening, to keep questioning, to realize that even what we know may someday be revised. Because knowledge isn't fixed. It evolves. What was considered true yesterday may be updated, reinterpreted, or disproven tomorrow. And the more we know, the more we understand how provisional so much of our understanding really is. This paradox also touches on identity. People often build their sense of self around what they know, their degrees, their expertise, their opinions. But when that knowledge is challenged, it can feel like the self is being challenged. So instead of staying open, we defend, we double down, we protect what we think we know rather than expand it. But the paradox reminds us that true confidence doesn't come from being right all the time. It comes from being willing to change your mind when new information arrives. The beauty of the knowledge paradox is that it can lead to something deeper than certainty. It can lead to wisdom. Wisdom isn't knowing everything. It's knowing how much there is you don't know, and learning how to navigate that space with humility and clarity. It's understanding that questions are often more important than answers, that simplicity can be dangerous when misapplied, and that curiosity is more powerful than conclusion. And perhaps most importantly, wisdom allows us to be wrong, not as a failure, but as part of the process. Ultimately, the knowledge paradox invites us to stay curious, to value learning not as a way to appear smart, but as a way to stay grounded. In a world that's always more complex than we realize, it reminds us that knowledge isn't a destination. It's a horizon that moves the closer we get to it. And maybe that's not a limitation, but a gift, because it means there will always be more to explore, more to ask, more to understand, not despite what we know, but because of it. Barber paradox. Some paradoxes arrive in the form of questions that sound innocent, even playful, until you try to answer them. The barber paradox is one of those. Imagine a small village with a very specific rule. There is one barber, and he shaves every man in the village who does not shave himself, no exceptions. So far, it seems like a quirky but manageable arrangement, until you ask one simple question. Who shaves the barber? If he shaves himself, then by definition he must not shave himself. But if he doesn't shave himself, then the rule says he must shave himself. Either option contradicts the rule. This is the barber paradox, a problem not with the village or the barber, or even the act of shaving, but with how the rule defines itself. The very structure that creates order also creates an impossible loop, a contradiction hiding inside perfect logic. At first glance, the paradox seems like a clever joke, a trick of language, but it reveals something deeper about systems that try to include themselves in their own rules. It's not just a problem of barbers or villages, it's a problem of self-reference. The system breaks not because it's chaotic, but because it's too rigid. It tries to be complete, to define who does what under every possible condition, and in doing so, it creates a case it can't handle. The rule applies to everyone, including the rule maker, and that's where it collapses. This same structure shows up in other paradoxes. In fact, the barber paradox is a simplified version of a much deeper one, Russell's paradox, which asks whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contains itself. The logic is the same. Once something refers back to itself, the system can't sustain the loop. The contradiction isn't emotional or philosophical, it's structural, and that's what makes it so powerful. You don't need emotion to feel the discomfort. The logic alone is enough. The barber paradox also reveals the limitations of categories. We like to organize things into groups, into systems, into rules, and usually it works. But when the boundaries become too perfect, when a category tries to include everything, including itself, it stops functioning, it turns inward and breaks. The paradox is that total order, when pushed far enough, creates chaos, not from outside the system, but from within. This isn't just a mathematical curiosity, it speaks to something human. We often build identities, roles, or systems that are meant to explain everything, including ourselves. But when those definitions become too absolute, we end up trapped inside them. A person who defines themselves entirely by a role, a leader, a helper, a rebel, can eventually reach a moment where the role contradicts itself. The helper needs help. The leader feels lost. The rebel finds no one left to oppose. And suddenly, the identity collapses under the weight of its own logic. The barber paradox is a mirror. It shows how systems break, not because they are irrational, but because they are too rational. It's a reminder that logic has limits, that even clear rules can create impossible outcomes if they try to account for every situation, including their own existence. The answer isn't to abandon structure. It's to recognize that no structure is immune to contradiction. Every system has an edge where the rules stop making sense. The key is to know where that edge is. Ultimately, the barber paradox isn't about shaving. It's about the danger of definitions that try to include themselves. It's a reminder that not everything can be neatly categorized, that sometimes the need for perfect clarity creates the very confusion it was meant to avoid. And maybe the most honest answer to the paradox isn't to fix it, but to acknowledge it. To say, this rule doesn't work here, and to live with that small, necessary gap in logic. Because that gap isn't failure. It's the space where structure ends and humility begins. Introspection, paradox. Self-awareness is often considered a strength, the ability to reflect, question, and understand yourself on a deeper level. Through introspection, we analyze our thoughts, trace our emotions, examine our choices. We ask ourselves why we do what we do, how we really feel, who we really are. But the process isn't as straightforward as it sounds, because the more we look inward, the more we interfere with what we're trying to observe. This is the introspection paradox. The act of self-examination alters the self being examined. You can't fully see your own mind without changing it in the process. The clarity you're seeking becomes distorted by the very effort to find it. This paradox becomes clear when you try to describe what you're feeling in the moment. As soon as you start labeling the emotion, is it sadness, anxiety, frustration? You begin moving away from the feeling itself and into analysis. You step out of the experience and into interpretation. The emotion, which was once direct and raw, now becomes a concept, something to be managed, explained, or categorized. And while that's useful in many ways, it also means that true, unfiltered experience becomes harder to access. You're no longer just feeling, you're watching yourself feel. And that changes everything. The same dynamic plays out in thoughts. You try to catch a thought mid-process, but by observing it, you slow it down, shape it, turn it into something else. It's like trying to grab water with your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips away. Introspection can help you reflect on patterns and gain insight, but it can also become a loop. You think about why you think what you think, and soon you're so deep in self-analysis that you lose touch with the original question. The effort to understand yourself turns into a performance of understanding, one that never quite resolves. This paradox also appears in identity. We ask, who am I really? And begin to dissect our traits, values, memories. But the self is not a fixed object. It changes depending on context, time, and attention. When you try to define it too precisely, you start filtering your experience through the lens of that definition. You begin reinforcing a version of yourself based on what you think you should be or how you believe others see you. The act of watching yourself live subtly changes how you live. You become both participant and observer, and in trying to be both, you sometimes lose sight of either. The introspection paradox also reflects how we sometimes confuse analysis with progress. We believe that the more we understand our patterns, the more we'll be able to change them. But knowing isn't always the same as transforming. You can be deeply aware of a habit, a fear, or a flaw, and still repeat it. Insight doesn't always lead to action. In fact, sometimes it becomes a substitute for it. We analyze ourselves endlessly without moving forward. We reflect not to grow, but to stay safe, to delay, to intellectualize, to stay inside our own minds where things feel more controllable than the messy reality of behavior. But this doesn't mean introspection is useless. It means we need to approach it with humility. Self-examination is not a microscope with perfect resolution. It's more like a mirror in low light, helpful but limited. The point isn't to find a final answer about who you are. It's to notice what's showing up right now. To be curious, not certain. To recognize that some things reveal themselves only when you stop trying to pin them down. Ultimately, the introspection paradox reminds us that the mind is both the lens and the object, and that makes perfect clarity impossible. But clarity might not be the goal. Sometimes, the act of looking inward is enough, not to solve yourself, but to slow down, to listen, to be present with whatever's there. And maybe the most honest kind of self-awareness isn't the one that knows everything, but the one that knows it never fully can. Empathy paradox. Empathy is usually seen as a virtue, the ability to feel what someone else is feeling, to see the world through their perspective, to connect with their experience. It's what allows us to support, relate, comfort, and care. But empathy, when taken too far, can become overwhelming. The more deeply we feel someone else's pain, the harder it becomes to stay grounded in our own emotional center. This is the empathy paradox. The very act of connecting with another person's suffering can begin to erode your capacity to help. You feel what they feel so strongly that it becomes difficult to distinguish where their pain ends and yours begins. This paradox often shows up in caregiving roles: therapists, nurses, parents, friends, people who are constantly asked to hold space for someone else's struggle. At first, empathy creates connection. It fosters understanding. But when you take in too much of someone else's emotional experience, you begin to carry it. You become emotionally fatigued, not because you don't care, but because you care so deeply that your own emotional boundaries start to blur. The pain you're witnessing becomes internal. And once that happens, your ability to offer steady support starts to diminish. This isn't about being too sensitive. It's about the limits of emotional absorption. Empathy, by nature, involves a kind of mirroring, a resonance with another person's inner state. But that resonance, if left unchecked, can lead to distress. You don't just understand what they're going through. You start to feel it as if it were your own. And while that might seem like the deepest form of compassion, it can quickly lead to burnout. Because in trying to help someone carry their emotional weight, you end up overwhelmed by the weight itself. The paradox deepens when we consider that empathy is often used to navigate moral and social decisions. We say things like, put yourself in their shoes, or imagine how they must feel. And this works up to a point. But past that point, the emotional load becomes counterproductive. You become so flooded by someone else's fear, grief, or anger that your judgment becomes clouded. You may shut down, withdraw, or become reactive. Not because you don't want to help, but because you've become emotionally dysregulated by proximity to their pain. This doesn't mean empathy is bad, far from it. But it highlights the importance of boundaries. To be truly present for someone else, you need to stay anchored in yourself. If empathy becomes fusion, if you lose your sense of self in the process, then the connection, while intense, is no longer stable. You can't pour from an empty cup. And the paradox is that you can be most helpful not when you feel everything with them, but when you feel enough to understand and remain steady enough to support. This is where the distinction between empathy and compassion becomes important. Empathy is feeling with someone. Compassion is acting with care for them. The first can drain you if taken too far. The second draws on a stable emotional distance. Compassion says, I see you, I feel for you, and I'm here to help, without becoming emotionally consumed in the process. It allows you to stay connected and centered, and that's what most people need. Not someone to fall into their suffering, but someone strong enough to stand beside it. The empathy paradox also raises difficult questions in a world filled with suffering. With global access to stories of pain, tragedy, injustice, and trauma, we're constantly exposed to emotional stimuli we can't respond to directly. This creates a quiet dilemma. How much pain are we supposed to take in? And at what point does empathy become paralysis? The paradox is that if we feel too much, we begin to shut down emotionally. But if we feel too little, we risk indifference. The balance is fragile and essential. Ultimately, the empathy paradox reminds us that caring deeply and caring wisely are not the same thing. That to truly support others, we must also care for our own emotional limits. That empathy is not about absorbing all the pain around us. It's about creating space where others feel seen, while we stay grounded enough to hold that space without collapsing into it. And maybe real empathy isn't losing yourself in someone else. It's being yourself fully while still meeting them where they are. Freedom paradox. Freedom is often described as the highest form of personal power. The ability to choose, to act, to live without constraint. It's something people fight for, dream about, protect. And in many ways, it defines what it means to be human. But freedom isn't just about the absence of limits. It's also about the presence of structure, the conditions that make meaningful choice possible. This is the freedom paradox. The more absolute freedom becomes, the more it begins to dissolve the stability that allows freedom to function. A world without rules sounds liberating, until you realize that without rules, freedom can turn into chaos, and chaos into insecurity. The very thing meant to empower us can start to erode the foundations of trust, cooperation, and responsibility that keep us free. This paradox often plays out in personal decisions. The idea of living without obligations, doing what you want, when you want, how you want, can seem ideal. But over time, a life with no structure, no commitments, no external accountability starts to feel directionless. Choice becomes overwhelming. Meaning becomes diluted. The absence of boundaries, rather than expanding your life, begins to flatten it. And what initially felt like freedom starts to feel like emptiness. The ability to choose anything loses its value when nothing truly matters. And so, paradoxically, freedom without limits can lead to a quiet kind of paralysis. This dynamic also plays out in social and political systems. A society that values total individual freedom without shared norms or responsibilities can struggle to maintain unity. If everyone does what they want without considering the impact on others, the result isn't freedom for all, it's fragmentation. mutual trust breaks down. Cooperation becomes difficult. The paradox is that some level of restriction is required to preserve the broader experience of freedom. Traffic laws limit your speed, but they make the road usable for everyone. Speech laws draw boundaries, but they also create space for civil discourse. Absolute freedom, if taken to its extreme, begins to cancel itself out. This paradox also touches on identity. We often seek freedom in the form of self-expression, the freedom to define who we are. But even here, unlimited freedom can become disorienting. If every identity is valid, if every belief is equally true, if every path is open, then nothing stands out. The freedom to be anything can quietly erode the ability to become something. Because becoming something, in a meaningful way, often involves limits. You commit to a path. You say no to certain options so you can say yes to others more fully. And in doing so, you give shape to your life. You exchange infinite possibility for focused direction. And that's not a loss. It's a structure that makes meaning possible. The freedom paradox also shows up in relationships. At first, we want space, to be ourselves, to keep our independence. But too much distance, too much autonomy can weaken connection. Without boundaries, without agreements, relationships drift. True intimacy doesn't grow in a field of endless freedom. It grows where trust is established, where expectations are clear, where freedom is balanced with responsibility. In this way, freedom and commitment aren't opposites. They rely on each other. The freedom to love deeply depends on the willingness to stay. What the paradox asks us to see is that freedom is not the same as detachment. It's not the removal of all limits, but the conscious choosing of which limits serve us. Freedom expands, not through avoidance, but through alignment, when the structures we choose reflect the values we care about. The presence of rules doesn't automatically mean oppression. In many cases, it's what allows freedom to become sustainable, stable, and shared. Ultimately, the freedom paradox reminds us that liberation is not found in having no boundaries, but in choosing the right ones. That real freedom is not about doing anything at any time, but about building a life where the choices you make lead somewhere meaningful. And maybe freedom, at its deepest level, isn't about escaping responsibility. It's about using your agency wisely so that you and the people around you can live not just without constraint, but with purpose. Present paradox. The present moment is all we ever really have. The past is memory, the future is speculation. But the now is where life actually happens. We eat, breathe, speak, act, think, always in the present. And yet, the strange thing is how difficult it is to actually be in it. Our minds drift constantly, replaying what's already gone or anticipating what hasn't yet happened. This is the present paradox. The only moment that is real is the one we're most likely to overlook. We talk about living in the present as if it's a simple practice. Just pay attention, just be here, just let go. But the more we try to grasp the present, the more slippery it becomes. The effort to be present can take us out of presence itself. This paradox shows up in ordinary moments. You sit down to relax, but your mind is still solving problems. You take a walk, but you're planning your to-do list. You spend time with someone, but you're replaying an earlier conversation. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. The mind is designed to move, to reflect, to anticipate, to evaluate. But when that movement becomes constant, the present turns into a backdrop, not a place we actually inhabit. We're physically here but mentally elsewhere. And the moment, instead of being lived, is observed from a distance. The paradox deepens when presence becomes a goal. In trying to be in the now, we often treat it like an achievement, something to reach, master, or measure. We read about mindfulness, set reminders, track habits, all in service of capturing something that, by definition, cannot be held. Because as soon as you become aware that you're present, you're slightly removed from it. You're no longer just in the moment. You're watching yourself be in the moment. The immediacy fades, The experience becomes an object of focus, and in focusing on it, we lose it. This doesn't mean reflection is wrong. It's essential. But reflection always happens slightly after the moment itself. And anticipation, while useful, always happens slightly before. The now is what's left when you're not thinking forward or backward. But the second you try to observe it, you've already moved. It's like watching a river and trying to freeze a single drop of water. The more you focus, the more you realize that the present is not a point in time. It's a movement, and that movement can't be paused or examined without stepping outside of it. The present paradox also reflects our discomfort with stillness. When we slow down, when we stop doing, when we stop planning, we often feel uneasy. The present feels empty, and we rush to fill it. We check a screen, create a distraction, look for a task. We mistake stillness for stagnation, but stillness isn't nothing. It's where everything actually unfolds. Thoughts arise there, emotions surface there, connection happens there, but only if we can stay long enough to notice. The paradox is that the moment we try to force that noticing, we disturb it. Presence isn't something you push toward, it's something you allow. This paradox also touches how we relate to meaning. We often assume meaning lives in memory or anticipation, in big events, milestones, plans. But most of life is made up of ordinary moments. And if we're always waiting for the next important thing, we miss the small, quiet details that give depth to daily experience. A glance, a pause, a breath. These moments don't announce themselves. They happen and pass unless we're paying attention. And the paradox is that attention can't be demanded. It has to be offered. Ultimately, the present paradox reminds us that the now isn't something to catch. It's something to return to, not with force, but with gentleness, not with discipline, but with awareness. The present doesn't need to be perfect, interesting, or productive. It just needs to be noticed. Because this moment, whatever it holds, is the only one that's real. And maybe the goal isn't to master the present, but to stop leaving it before it's over.